Is Art Flynn, and I'm just getting ready to start to write a story of my father's life over in Ireland. The year was 1861. The city was Tralee County Karry. It was on January the 11th at the Flynn family that he was born. As a young guy, he used to make his spending money by going out catching wild canaries. They put some kind of a slack, sticky stuff on these trees or limbs, and these birds would light on it, and then they couldn't get off, and they'd go over and pick them up. And that's where he would make his spending money, as he told me. And he used to do an awful lot of swimming in the Shannon River, and he used to go down to the ocean, and he was really a swimmer. He could swim like a fish. And as he was growing up, he used to work in a bakery. And by the time he got to be 18 or 19 years old, he was a baker by trade. And after that, he done any kind of a thing that any young fellow would do. There wasn't much any kind of jobs for people to do in Ireland. So what they did the best they could, and they just about lived on potatoes, and if they didn't have potatoes, they would have starved to death. The British government was giving them an awful lot of trouble. A lot of them people couldn't earn no money, and people that had homes, old houses, couldn't pay no taxes, and because they couldn't pay taxes, the British government was in there, and what they would do, they'd come along and tear them down and throw the people out in the street. So that really got under my dad's skin. So finally, one evening, they were tearing down a house, so my father and another party went up, and as they were tearing this house down, knocking it down, my dad and this other party run up there with clubs, and they killed a couple of them. And about that time, they had to make a break to get out of there, because if they would have caught them, it would have been just too bad. They probably would have hung them both. So what he did, he ran on down to the waterfront, and he happened to discover down there that there was a big whaling boat just on time at the dock. So he runs up to the dock, and he says, "What's the chance of getting a job on this ship?" And the guy said, "Just a minute, the captain's up there and I'll call him." So he called the captain hollered down. He says, "What can you do? What kind of work can you do?" Well, he says, "I'm a baker and a cook by trade." Well, he says, "Get the hell on here. We're going to pull off in a few seconds." So he got on, and they sailed out in the ocean whaling for quite a while. And finally, they landed in Boston to pick up supplies for the ship. And at that time, my dad, he left the boat and changed his name also. It wasn't O'Flynn, it was Flynn from then on. And he worked as any kind of a job he could get. And he finally got a job down to where there's a bunch of livery stables. In them days, everybody had horses and carriages, and they'd have these livery stables to take care of them. So anyway, my dad had a job. The first job he had was working in this big livery barn, cleaning barns and wheeling manure out by the wheelbarrow up to railroad cars alongside of this big bunch of barns and horse lots. They had the railroad, so that's where they unload the manure and they ship it out to the country on these railroad cars. But he worked there for a while, and then pretty soon he figured, well, I want to go on in towards the big cities. So he headed from there, and he went on back, and he got to Elgin, Illinois. And there he got a job in a bakery there, and he worked there for several months. And he used to tell me that he slept over a place where they made whiskey barrels, be sleeping all day, and about the time they'd get done in the evening, But the time they got done and the noise quit down there with hearing pounding, he'd wake up and then he'd go out, get ready to go to work because they worked mostly nights making this bread. So anyway, there was a restaurant by the name of Saunders where my father used to eat all his meals, and he ate there for quite a while, and finally there was a young lady there who was a table waiter, and my father got acquainted with her, and they finally got pretty thick. And my aunt happened to notice that. It was her aunt, the Saunders, who she worked for, that owned the restaurant, told her that, asked her, what about this guy that she was talking to and is getting kind of thick with? And she says, his name was Flynn, and she says, was this party? What church does he belong? And my aunt was a Methodist, but my father, she says, this James is a Catholic. Well, she says, I don't want you going around with no Catholic. She says, we're a Methodist and we don't believe in going with somebody like that. And so my aunt sent my mother back to Waterloo, Iowa, where my mother's folks had this big farm, and back there she went. And finally my father and her, they wrote back and forth, and pretty soon my dad made a trip out to New Hartford to see my mother. And my mother's folks was Ingalls, was their name. The same Ingalls, by the way, is one of the Ingalls that was in that show they've had for a long time, Little House on the Prairie. One of her relation was one of the Ingalls that was in that show. So finally, my father visited her in Iowa there, and pretty soon they decided they'd get married, and they had a wedding, and my father and my mother went back to Elgin, and he had his job there, and they worked there for quite a while. And then finally they decided they wanted to get into another location, so they left Elgin and they went into Chicago. And my dad finally rented a building, and he started his own bakery. So they had a bakery business at 47th and Ashland in Chicago. And they run that bakery for quite a long time. And then finally, they read the paper where there was opening up a couple cemeteries right out south at 111th. This is in the Chicago limits, 111th Street, right out. Well, it was just about the city limits at Mount Greenwood, Illinois. So they go out there and they rented a building that was there, and they opened up a restaurant. There already was 4 or 5 restaurants there because there was these 2 cemeteries were within a half a mile of these restaurants. And I remember very well of the restaurants. I was born upstairs over this one restaurant. But in a couple years, my dad decided he wanted his own building, so he built a great big building that was closer yet to the cemeteries. And it was a big cement block building. They had a saloon in the front. And then part way back, was a dining room started, and the dining room was a big one. It ran clear from the street to the alley and the kitchen in the back. And I remember we could feed up to 200 people in that dining room. And they run that for years. And that's where my brothers and sisters, some of them were born there at that time. My dad wrote letters back home in Ireland, and he told his folks to pack up and come over to America. So they all come over. He He had 3 sisters and 2 brothers. And they finally come over here. And I remember one of his sisters' name was Margaret. They called her Maggie. Well, Maggie used to work for him in his restaurant. And it wasn't long. In a couple of years, she finally met a man by the name of Joe LeBeau. So she finally married Joe LeBeau. And Joe LeBeau, later on, he also had a restaurant down the street from our restaurant. There was 5 restaurants in one block. At the foot of this were these 2 cemeteries. And in them days, people come to the funerals. They didn't have the hearses with the motored hearses like now. It was all drawn by horses and carriages. The people would ride in carriages, and they'd come out to the cemeteries that way. And after the funerals, they'd all come down to these restaurants. And the deal was nobody knew how much stuff to cook. They'd all cook so much food. They had corned beef and cabbage and so forth, and they all were together. There were nobody fighting one another about business. They all had to play ball together. So what happened, sometimes they'd all be going mostly over to other restaurants. And if they did, they wouldn't have enough food, so what they did, they'd go out the back door and come over to the other restaurants and get food enough to feed the extra people they had, and vice versa. That's the way they went in business, and they never were any of them having any trouble. They all got along very well. The name of all the restaurants were, besides my folks' restaurant, was Cunningham, was across the street, and next to our family restaurant was a party named Sullivan, and then down the street there was O'Malley, and then across the street there was Murphy, and then there was Joe LeBeau, which was my father's brother-in-law. Everything run pretty smooth along that times, and then finally one Sunday, my dad always liked to hunt. He never could. They wouldn't allow him to have a gun in Ireland, so he had everything he wanted after he had lived over here. So finally, one Sunday morning, he left our restaurant with his bird dog and a shotgun, and out west of where we lived, there was a big lot of swampy ground with a lot of jack snipes, birds, and wild ducks and so forth. So he used to go out there on a Sunday and try his luck, and he'd get a lot of these snipes. He shot quite a few of them. And this Sunday morning, he was walking down the street, and his dog was running ahead of him, and the dog happened to run up by the front of a doorway of a place down the street, about a couple blocks, and as a guy jumped out in front of the dog, and he kicked the dog. And my dad said, "You kick that dog again, I'll kill you." He was madder than hell. It was just about as bad kicking one of his dogs as somebody would have kicked one of us children. So the guy took another kick at the dog, and my dad shot him. Then my dad said, "For crying out loud, what do I do?" So he turned around and he walks on back home to his restaurant, and they call the police. And the police asked him what happened, and he told them what happened about this guy coming out, and he kicked the dog, and he said, "If you kick my dog again, I'll kill you." And he said, "That's just what I did." So they said, "Well, we won't lock you up, but there's going to have to be a hearing." So at the hearing, when they had it, they had this guy's wife that my dad shot. She was there, and they had court there, and they asked him what happened. He told what happened, and finally after he got done, they finally called her on the witness stand, and they asked her, what did she think of the deal of this guy shooting her husband? She says, "I want to tell you," she says, "my husband was a drunkard. He'd come home drunk, and he would just kick me and slap me all over the house. He'd done me a favor for shooting my husband. He says, I don't blame him a bit. So anyway, they let my dad go. He never was prosecuted after that. That was the end of that hunting day too. Right after that, one day a party come into my father's saloon, and they asked if they knew of anyone that was a good swimmer. And he says, why? Well, he said there's a party just drowned out about 3 miles south on Kedzie Avenue at the Clay Hole. The Clay Hole was a place where the Illinois Brick Company that made bricks got their clay to make brick out of. Anyway, this place was about 90 foot deep. That was just like a well, but it covered about 50 acres. And it was full of water, about 90 foot deep. And a party had drowned it in there, and they didn't know what, they wanted to get him out. So they asked my dad if he would go out and see if he could bring the body up. So he went out there, and he dived in that clay hole about 3 times. Anyway, the 3rd time he brought the body up. And of course the body had been dead for 4 or 5 hours by that time. But anyway, it was so deep where he dived in there that was hard on one of his ears. He got hard hearing in one of his ears. And by this time, I had 11 brothers and sisters older than I am. And this time, when I was born, this was the year 1903. So I made number 12 in that family at that time. Upstairs, over this slope and restaurant that my folks had, we had about 20 bedrooms, lots of room. We also had a lot of boarders, people that worked in the cemetery that boarded there and stayed there all the time. And there was always something going on at Flynn's place. The oldest one was named Grace. She was born in 1886. And then after Grace, there comes James, and he was born in 88. Then there was Tessie. Tessie was born in 89. Then Eva was born in 1890. Then there's Mary Marcella in 1891. Margaret in 92. Then there was John in 1894. Then Daniel in 1895. Joanne, 1896, Catherine, 98. Then there was Agnes, Margaret, 1900. Then there was Art in 1903. At that time, this place of business where my folks had was only about 2 blocks from the entrance to 2 different cemeteries. There was Mount Greenwood on the left and Mount Olivet on the right. And I remember in the summer when I was small, 4 or 5 years old, Molly used to take all of us kids and we used to go up in the hot summertime, and we'd go up in the cemetery, and there used to be a place across the street where they sold brick ice cream. So she'd go in there and get one of the big brick ice cream. We had a bunch of spoons and stuff we took along with us from the restaurant and plates, and we'd go over in the cemetery, and nice and cool over there. These great big marble slabs over graves. Why, we'd sit around on the edge of them and use it like a table, and we would eat our ice cream, and after that we'd walk around the cemetery. They had a lot of big monuments, some big statues, and great big grave vaults. They had some grave vaults there that there was some priest by the name of Father McDonald. After he died, he had it built while he was alive, but we could look in the big brass door, and you could look back in this big vault, and it looked just like an altar in the church back in the end of this thing. Was about 25 foot long, and on each side was marble doors where the caskets were. It would hold about 16 caskets in there, but you couldn't see the caskets, only the marble slabs that covered them up on the side and the big brass handles on the marble slabs. But that's what we used to do in the hot summertime, was walk around that cemetery. It used to be just like a wonderful park with all these big trees and stuff in it, and that's where we played most of the time, was going through the cemetery. We also had a cottage right back of this restaurant and property we had there across the alley, and that's where we had a big house there, a cottage we called it. And I remember we could use that too besides upstairs in our house. And we had a cook and them. They used to live in this cottage. They lived there, just made it their home. And out behind that was mostly all open country. And in them days, they had coursing matches. A coursing match is where they had the place about 20 acres out there, and they had it fenced off with woven wire. And every so far, they had a hole in the woven wire along the edge, a escape hole, they call that. And I remember that time they used to ship rabbits and jackrabbits from Kansas and places, and they used to have, on Sundays, they'd go over there and they have a whole bunch of cages of rabbits. And my dad had about 12 dogs of his own that he used to keep back of the restaurant in a shed back there, and we used to take them out for this coursing match. But what they did, they'd go out there and they'd have all these greyhounds, and they'd hold them back, they had leashes on them, and they'd turn the rabbit loose. Of course, the dogs get all excited, and they'd take off and start chasing this rabbit. A lot of times a rabbit, if you were, we'd give them they'd give them a long distance to take off, but the dogs knew they were out there, and they were ready to chase them, and the rabbits were kind of they figured something's going to happen. So they'd start running, and we'd turn the dogs loose, and they were chasing these rabbits. And of course, once in a while, a rabbit would run closer to the fence. He had a place to escape. He could get away. If he got away, it was better luck to him. He was on his own then. But I remember going out there, and there'd probably be hundreds of people out there to watch this here coursing match. As time went on, people were talking about a big land opening in Oklahoma, and also at the same time, they had a big land opening in South Dakota where you could draw a claim and win 160 acres of land. So my father thought, he says, I like to hunt, so I think I'll go on out there, take the train out, and see what I can do about winning some of that land. So anyway, he talked it over with my mother, and she says, that'll be a good vacation. Why not go out and see what you can do? So he went out there, and he finally won a claim. He come back from South Dakota to Chicago and told my mother, well, I've won this land now. I'm going to have to do something about homesteading on that and have to put so much time in on it. So anyway, she said, what are you going to do? And he says, well, I'll get Anthony and my sister Maggie, and there's enough of them, they can take over and run this place while I go out there for a couple of years and back and forth. And that's what he did. He got Anthony to run his saloon there while he was to move from Mount Greenwood to South Dakota to the homestead site at Gregory, South Dakota is where it was. And this homestead he won joined on the edge of the outskirts of a town. There's only about a half a mile from our gate post into the main part of town. The town finally developed. There's about 1,500 people in this town when we all were settled down out there. Sure, and so they were, you see in the paper where they were opening up land, there's going to have an opening in Oklahoma at that time, and about the same time there's having a land drawing, what you call a land drawing, where you could draw claims, which a claim was 160 acres of land if you won it. So he got thinking, well, he said, I've got these boys are all getting bigger now, and I think what I'll do, I like to hunt, and I'm going on out. I think I'll go to South Dakota, he said. So he goes out there as he's opening up this land drawing, and finally he rode on a train clear out to Fairfax, South Dakota, and there's where they had the land drawing for this land at Gregory County. And so he was out there, and they had the drawing, and he won a piece of land, and his piece of land was right up against a town site, you know, where a town was going to be built. It was all prairie out there at the time they drew the land, and there was no railroad from Fairfax clear to Gregory. It was about 30-some or 40 miles. That time they have to go by stagecoach. A railroad wasn't built up through there yet. It took a few years later before the railroad ever got there. But he won this piece of land, and he comes on back to Chicago and told my mother, he says, I want a piece of land out there. So he said, I think we'll keep our restaurant. We'll have it here, and I'll have my, he had brothers and that run it. And he said, I think I'll go out. He says, you can run with the restaurants. You can either ride a train back and forth if you want to go. And so anyway, we kept that restaurant going. So out west we got ready, and I remember they, from the railroad company in them days, for so much money, you could rent a railroad car that you could take all your furniture, machinery, anything. You can even take 2 or 3 head of cattle in that car. You know, that's what most of the pioneer people that drew claims did. They'd rent a railroad box car and take all their belongings and go out to a town, and then some of them have teams of horses and wagons and everything in that railroad car, and some furniture, enough to get by on, and get to these towns where they would unload it and go on out and stake a tent and build up a shack, something to live in, because they had on this land, if you wanted, you had to put in so many months a year time living on it, and you also had to plow up so many acres, maybe 10 acres of land. You'd have to have a break and plow that up, and of course you could have a garden and so forth, but that's what it was at that time. So finally, anyway, we were getting ready to go.
That time. But so my dad goes and has them both recorded, the one he won west of Gregory
and the one that he won 4 miles east of Gregory. But he found out afterwards that this party had sold him that piece of land, also sold that homestead drawing to another fellow for $800. But my dad had recorded his first, so it was his. But the other fellow lost what he put down for that piece of land. Well, anyway, he caught the next train going back to Dakota, and he goes back and he tells Ma about him winning the land and also buying a piece of land, and he says, we can now start getting ready, he says, and get things together. So when I get part of this house built out there, we can all make it out there, and that will be a good place to raise a family as large as ours, because at that time we had several children. There was about, at that time, 7 of them, at least 7 or 8. And then later there was more, but there was more before the 7 or 8. But from beginning to the end, there was 15 of his children. But of all the 15, there was only 9 of us that pulled through, that come out of it. It went on. And he heads back for the Dakotas. But by the time that he returned, the railroad had went from Fairfax up as far as Bonesteel. Then at Bonesteel was the end of the line. And at that time, it was still 30 miles on across country to Gregory. So at that time, he bought a couple loads of lumber, and he hired a fellow to haul him up, a freighter. And this freighter hauled him, and my dad, and all his equipment, his camp and tents and stuff up to Gregory. And my dad rode into Gregory on the first load of lumber that ever went in there. So that was the starting of the building. So he set up his tent from there. He went on, they hired some help, and they built one big room, which we later on moved into. But in the meantime, my mother was back in Chicago, gathering everything together to make the move to the Dakotas. And at the same time, she rented our place of business there to my father's brother, whose name was Anthony. And Anthony run that place while we went west. So my mother finally gets this big immigrant car loaded with everything, and them days there, these immigrant cars, you could put anything in it, a towel or a horse or anything you wanted to take along. So they loaded that thing with household goods, everything that they figured they'd need and could use, and also a lot of odds and ends, and hell, they even had an Irish jaunting cart, a 1-horse, 2-wheel cart. And besides that, had railroad jacks, track jacks, everything that you'd need to jack to build enough to move it or whatever you wanted to do with it. So anyway, on this train, he finally makes it with all his children, and they take off for the Dakotas. And he arrived in Bonesteel, I think it was late in the afternoon. That as far as the train went. So we all stayed overnight in Homestead that night. So early the next morning, we hired a fellow by the name of Carl. He run the stagecoach, one of them, that went up to Gregory. And that was about 30 miles away. So anyway, there was enough of us to fill up the stagecoach, and we also had several dogs, and we didn't know what we were going to do with that. And Mr. Carl said, just tie one of them on the back axle and let him run along, and these other dogs all follow as we went up the road. He said, there won't be no charge for the greyhounds because I'm not carrying. They're just tied on. So on our way, We went across country, and there was towns there such as St. Charles was a little town, about 10 miles from Homestead. Another one was Eric, another 10 miles. Then there was a Burke, another few miles. Then we finally got to Gregory late at night, and that's where we unloaded. And we had these tents set up, a couple tents in this one big room that we all could cook in. And this cabin that's itself also had a big attic in it, that most of it slept up there, the kids, and then my brothers just slept in these tents outside. And we had just a big tuck stove, a big tuck rooms in there, and to tuck on. And I remember my mother telling about one time we got kind of a electrical storm come up and lightning, and all they had was a tin pipe, going out the rest, There's lightning like the devil, and she was afraid the shaft was going to be blown down. It's so strong out in that open country. But anyway, we went through that storm and on to other things. And as time went on, we kept adding on to this one big room, and we had several rooms. We also had several houses all into one, under one big roof. We had plenty of room for everything that we owned. We had a friend by the name of Watson. He was a sign painter, and he used to stay with us there, and he painted signs for all these slums and buildings that were being built on Main Street. And I remember it, he painted a sign, and we put it over the front of our house. Such a big house, and we called it, the sign said on it, Rose Lawn Farm. The front yard was full of wild roses. It was all sod yet growing. But later on, we plowed everything up just like everybody else. This house had 8 rooms in it after we were done building, and one big, large, 2-room house behind that we used for our warehouse. Storage. Also had a big coal den and on the back of this 8-room house, all glassed in. My dad also bought another farm a mile south of the one we lived in, west of Gregory. And on that farm there was a shack, so he moved that off over to where the others. We had several buildings around this homestead. By the time we got done building, and it was quite a setup. Well, anyway, my grandfather finally, he came out from Chicago. He was way up around 85 to 90 years old. And when they had this land drawing for the next county up from ours, which they call Trip County, my dad took him over to the land office and had him draw a number. And he also drew a claim, which was out by a great big lake. The lake was a couple miles long. They call the lake Dog Ear Lake. And this lake is 15 miles south of Winter, South Dakota. And so that's where my grandfather, he homesteaded that. And one of my brothers used to stay with him part-time. And my sister Molly used to stay in. And he moved up on that. So that's another farm. This farm, we bought it off of a party named Giles, and after he bought it, I remember when I used to go over there and was looking at this farm, they were plowing it up with braking plows, hand plows. And before he had horses on a plow, and they had 2 of them going to plow that up. Also, next farm to that, there's a party by the name of Grant that had a great big steamer. And this steamer was a big, they call it an Avery. It's run with burn coal and team just looked like a railroad locomotive. Well, anyway, they pulled 12 plows with this big steamer, and the 12 furrows at a time was plowed. But they could only plow in certain kind of weather. It couldn't be too wet or the wheels would be slipping, and if it was too dry, the ground was too hard to pull all in. So that was the only trouble about plowing with the big steamer. But I remember they plowed it all up before they put the fences up because it took so far to turn around and go back to cut the next furrow going the other way. We owned about 30-some head of horses, and we used to drive them back and forth to pasture on the west side of Gregory from this farm where we homesteaded to the one we bought at Boyles where they were plowing up. We had a pasture over there. Every morning we'd take them back one way or we'd bring them back another. I can remember of going across these railroad tracks with this herd of cattle and horses. But later on in the falls when we had feed, we just keep them at home and we had feed racks and big barns in the winter. Come on, we had all this hay and stuff in there. They used to also cut hay at Dog Ear Lake, which was about 20-some miles out there. They'd go out there every fall with tents, and they would cut a lot of hay, and that's all they had to do, is just cut hay, and then when they had time, they would all go out with a couple hay racks, a couple four-headed teams. They'd go out there one day, and then they'd stay overnight. They'd load up the next day and hunt around, and then probably another day later, the weather looked good, they'd take off back for Gregory with 2 big loads of hay, sometimes more. Second, when they're hauling the hay, they could do a lot of hunting while they were out there, and they could be hunting on the way out and the way back. They always carried rifles and shotguns and had dogs with them. One time they were telling me that they were out right south of Sloan, cutting across the prairie, and up jumped a jackrabbit, and they had one little greyhound. They used to call it a whippet. It was a smaller hound, but it was a fast runner. And this dog ran this rabbit to run him out in a big circle and turn around and keep running and bring that rabbit right back fairly close, or she could either take a shot at and get it, but every time they come in, this rabbit would make another circle and she'd make another one. They kept that up for about a half hour, and then finally she got this rabbit on the way back, and as if she was chasing this rabbit, they were driving down the road. They never stopped, they just kept on going, and she'd keep bringing them on and keep running them, and finally up jumps another rabbit, and she gets confused between the 2 rabbits. The one made a dive and got away, and she started running after a new one, a different rabbit. And hell, she ran and ran, and she caught that rabbit. But after she caught that rabbit, she just laid down, and they put her in the hay rack, and about an hour later, she died. So that was the end of that dog. There's one less fur to feed. Well, anyway, talking about dogs, my dad had about a dozen of them around, and every time one of these old-fashioned cars, like a 2-cylinder Buick, could come chugging down the road, these dogs would all take off and start chasing these cars and barking, and my dad used to holler, he said, "Whistle, Art, whistle." He couldn't whistle, he couldn't whistle, and I'd get laughing, and I couldn't whistle either. But I'd laugh at the damn dogs that were running, they could run faster than the cars were going. And it was kind of comical to watch them going. And that was quite a deal when to watch them going. These greyhounds and trail hounds and all the yelling. The guy in the car didn't know what the hell to think. And these dogs are yipping and yipping and as they went by. Every time my dad would get ready to go hunting, he had a police whistle. He used to come out and he'd blow it. And the dogs, the dogs would all come running. And about that time, he'd start grabbing this dog and that one, and they'd lock them up in a big granary. He'd lock them all up at the ones he wanted to take. Plus, he had a favorite. He figured it was better. He had a trail hound and another one that he wanted to take with him. But these other dogs finally got wise to him. He used to come out of the house with his shotgun and blow the whistle. And when he did, these damn dogs, most of them, done a disappearing yet. They'd all run to hide. And later on, as he'd get away from the house about a mile, he'd happen to hear something behind him and look behind, and here's all these dogs that hit were following him. They knew just what to do to go hunting. These Canaries, these Indians that live down in the Pocket Creek, they always like Paul pretty well, and of course, they all like him. If you want people to like you, just be on the giving end of it, you know. He always had plenty of whiskey to drink, and they weren't allowed to sell whiskey to Indians in the saloons in them days, so he really had a lot of friends, these Indians, and he used to tell them, anytime you want to go hunting, Mr. Flynn, he says, you just let us know, and we'll send in a buggy and a team, and we'll get you, and you can stay out there with us and do your hunting. So he'd always have 3-4 bottles of whiskey, you know, and he'd tell them, well, I'll go out next week, and they'd stop on that day, and they'd be waiting, so he'd give us this Phil Canary. He was quite a guy. He would come in, you know, and stop, and I'd give him 2 or 3 drinks, and he said, well, they'd load up his shotguns and a couple of these trail hounds, and they'd take off. It was about 8 miles southeast of Gregory. Stop, and I'd give him 2 or 3 drinks, and he said, well, they'd load up his shotguns and a couple of these trail hounds, and they'd take off. It was about 8 miles southeast of Gregory on the Pocket Creek. And there used to be a lot of these cottontail rabbits out there, and he used to go out there and bring in 25 to 35 of them at once. But the way he'd do, he'd clean them all. It was late in the fall and winter. He'd fill them full of hay. He'd cut them and then put hay on them, just leave the skin on them, but he's ready to eat them. But they were the best eating of all the wild game, I think. So that was a difference in what we had to eat, besides pork or beef. We always liked the cottontails the best. And he used to like to hunt these deer, these doves, these wild doves. He'd make a kind of a dumpling, dumplings, you know, like you would with chickens, and dumplings out of them. And I never did like the taste of them because they always had a funny smell. It smelled like a wet diaper, this baking powder or whatever they used in them. So I couldn't eat that. But he would eat it. And we also, on our big farms, he was crazy about eating these young pigeons. And we had pigeon boxes nailed all over the front of this big granary. And I can remember at just about sundown, that ridge row and that granary was about 50 to 60 feet long. We just loaded that whole roof with pigeons. They'd roost there at night. Then the next day they'd be take off and fly all around the different neighboring country and feed, and then they'd be back again the next night and leave again. Then other times he had his spring wagon, his team of horses, and he used to get a big jug of water and take a little grab, and he used to go down to Topers on the Missouri River. And cave leaves down on the river. And these cave leaves, and then they just probably had a small cornfield on the river bottom. And all they mostly had was big family Kegley and Topers. And that's how he met them. And they used to cook out of little 10-gallon buckets and stuff. Of course, my dad had a lot of Western supply kettles and stuff. And he used to take them out there, you know, and he set them up and he'd cook and equip. And he'd come in with a lot of game from there. One time he come back and I said, where's Fooey? There was a trail hound. He says, he says, when I got ready to come home, Fooey, he must have been chasing a rabbit down the line somewhere in the woods, and he didn't show up. So he said, well, it was getting late in the morning and I wanted to make it home. Had all these rabbits that had killed, and get home. And so he figured he'd make it. So he took off. They were over 20 some mile out there, you know. And, hell, about an hour after he was home, we got the horse run hitched and everything put away. His damn dog come running up, you know. He all the way in from the Missouri River. He found his way back. You couldn't lose one of them then. This farm of ours took me in mind of the Grand Central Station. These people, he'd go out and hunt out there and that. They'd come in, you know, different times, and they'd stay overnight. It was just like a hotel to them, and they were just exchanging, you know, stay in one place, stay in the other, and so forth. And hell, as I remember, that went on for years. And that's where we met the Langan. He hunted and went out there, and hell, they would come in, and I met the kids, and they used to come in when we'd pass, and they'd help us pass. Johnny would, and I'd go back out there and help them. And that's what we do in exchange help, and they had quite a place out there too. Like I tried to book that at this point. At the same time, my dad had a Flynn on Main Street in Gregory. Later on, there's an oil company at this date, at the Farmers Union oil station there on the corner. He owned a couple lots, and he had that saloon running there in the early days. And at the time, they had the land drawing in Trip County. He had that saloon there. And there wasn't a church that built that town, and I remember on Sundays, he used to close the saloon up, and they'd come down there, you know, and they'd have mass in that church. They'd pile up a bunch of whiskey cases like an oven, and then they'd put on a cloth over it, you know, and put these candle holders and so forth up, and they'd have church in this saloon. Because they didn't have no church yet. And also, he used to do some damn much hunting at Tralee Lake. In the fall, just before they'd have Thanksgiving, they're finally getting enough money together to build a church. Everybody was pitching in, you know, and a little here and a little money there. And he used to go out to Dagon Lake. One year there, he shot enough wild ducks, mallards, and ducks of all kinds, and brought them back. He used to take the guts out of them and just put hay in them till we get them home, and then cook them, you know. And I remember he finished them with enough wild ducks to feed that whole Catholic bazaar when they had it. He wasn't satisfied with the throne that he had in Gregory and the one in Chicago, his brothers running. So he goes out way out west in Trip County over into a place they call Whitten, South Dakota. And he had his throne out there, and that was around 60 miles from Gregory, out north and a little west. And John used to, they had big teams, you know, 4 head of horses or 6 even sometimes, on these wagons, and they'd have big freight wagons that they'd haul all this beer and whiskey and stuff like that out to this throne. He used to be a freighter. He was about 15 years old. He was the youngest of all the freighters. All the others were men, grown men. But he used to have that, but he always had plenty of help. If he'd get stuck on the road, they never had no highways or nothing. They just take off across country up by Hamel, South Dakota. They took the place where the going was good. There were several different routes going out to these towns. But anyway, he would stop probably out to Hamel overnight. That was about a 30-mile run, at least. And they'd sleep out there, and then he'd go on to Whitten, and then unload, and then come on back. And I remember, hell, it would be 2 days going, a couple days coming. And I remember when I was a kid that when he'd come back, like, he used to go out in this building behind. We had a big stove and take a bath and hell, because everybody was lousy in them days from stopping in these damn 2-brick hotels where they stopped. take a good bath and get clean clothes on again before he'd even, that's the first thing he did when he'd arrived at our place. And I remember one time, my dad was running that Sloan and Whitten, the United States Marshal come along, and he was checking these Indians over and that, and in them days it was against the law to sell an Indian a drink. But hell, there was 3/4 Indians and about 1/4 whites out there, and he come in there and there was about 3 big Indians laying drunk, laying against the wall, on the south wall. And he says, Mr. Flynn, he says it's against the law to give them Indians a drink. He says, I know that. I wouldn't give them a drink if their damn tongue was hanging out of yard. You notice he said, yeah, but if he didn't sell it to these Indians, he never would have had any business. So he sold plenty of it. And one night he heard a lot of banging on the door, and he went down and he opened it up. And here it was, this Bill Canary, and he had a 30-30 Marlin rifle. And he says, Flynn, he says, I've got to get moving again. He says, I'm going to give you this gun. I don't want to be caught with it. He said, they just shot Terror. He says, the United States Army government men killed him. And he said, they would have killed me too if you said, and I've been riding all night and all day and night again. He was hiding around it in Bull Creek, stopped there and had something to eat. And I remember he getting some more, a little food with him. He took it with him and he took another horse after leaving the gun, and he headed out there to West Pine Ridge or Wounded Knee somewhere where these Indians all claim they had cousins. All Indians are cousins. They play there. I also met an Indian out around Whitten. He lived between Winter and Carter. This Indian did. And he had a lot of horses. But these horses, the government used to give them to the Indians, and they put a mark on them, a big ID branded on them. And these Indians weren't supposed to sell them, but we had a couple of them. We had one, we called the horse Red Hill, after the Indian's name, his name. So, I can remember one of these horses, he was an outlaw, never was broke. It's a big gray horse, and I remember on a Sunday, my dad told my brothers to put the harness on him and break them. So anyway, they had him out there this Sunday morning and out by the barn, and they had about 6 foot of rope between the horse and this post. They had the horse tied up this post, and they were trying to get harness on this horse. And every time you throw it on the horse's back, the horse would kick it all to pieces, kick it over a barn, took it out of sight. He looked out the window and he saw what was going on. And he said, they've got that horse character down. He said, I'm going out and show them how to put that harness on that horse. So he went down there and he said, just a minute. He said, you guys, when you throw that harness up on that horse, he thinks you're whipping him. So he said, I'll show you how to do it. So he walks up and between this horse and the post and goes to pet him, and he reached up and he touched him on the end of the nose, and the horse pulled back, and my dad was between this horse and the post, and this horse just put all his damn weight on his front hoof right on top of my dad's foot, and backed up and took hold, and he had a big bunion there anyway, and it made him so damn mad that he took a punch at the horse. And he finally let go then, and he limped up to the house. And that was the end of a perfect day for him. That was the end of showing somebody how to put harness on a horse. Jim, my oldest brother, he had a job working for Sanford & Slaughter uptown at this time, and he was their stenographer. He made out all these land, contracts and so forth. And he was the only guy in town that had an automobile. He had a little red Max with a 2-cylinder one that's like the one Jack Benny they always talk about, his Red Maxwell. There was one like that, and I remember he lived on the east side of Gregory, and he used to run that around. It was a two-cylinder, and Bess was with him one Sunday, and no windshield at all on it, and it was a right-hand drive, and it had a shifting gear on the right side. You put the head to go ahead, and you pull back to back up, and they had a middle, this lever, the big brass lever in there, and also had a brake handle. So this Sunday, Bess was with him, and she had on a great big hat, and Jim was driving around the town with her, and he pulled right on up in front of their house, and everybody, of course, in them days was looking out, It was like if somebody would land with a helicopter by your house today. But at that time, they pulled up there, and everybody looking up. He had to stop. He pulled the lever back, and Bess started to stand up. When she started to stand up, he pulls his lever back, and the damn thing jumps backwards right out from under it. So she fell right over the front of the car. He had on the ground, and that was that for the car driving along. But I remember he had this real estate office, and he used to, on the side, he would trade for different things, such as, he had cars, and he even sold his red car to John Horst later on. I heard about that. And then he traded cars. He had a big car called the Thomas Flyer. It was a great big one, a big touring car. It had a big flaxen horn on it, and they had tires on it as high as a wagon wheel. And I remember that car real well. He had that, and he traded it to a guy down by Brocksburg, Nebraska, that had a steam engine, steamer for running flash machines and for plowing. And Jim used to have these pictures of these big tractors and steamers and separators and plows and hanging around the real estate office. But out of that, he traded this old car for that steamer outfit. And I remember this one day we saw a big tractor coming right up the road, and they drove right up to our yard, and they said, "Where do you want us to leave this before we put the fire on?" They fired it up with coal, and they just had enough coal to get it up there. I remember when I come home from school, I stood out there right on the north side of our house. So anyway, I looked it over and I thought, boy, that's quite a thing, because I'd already saw a big tractor pulling plows. But the joke of it was, this damn tractor, these plows didn't even belong to this tractor. These plows were made for a hell of a lot bigger outfit than that. We had about 6 plows, and that damn thing I don't think could pull 3 at that time. But anyway, John and Dan, they were just big kids then, around 16 or 17. And so Sunday morning come along, and that was a day of rest. So they figured, it was rainy weather anyway, and they figured what they'd like to do. John was always interested in a little bit of steam engines. Like he got one for Christmas one time, and they bought it, and you had a little alcohol lamp on it and make steam and run a little, you see the little engine running. So he got it in his head, he could run it. He knew all about steam from that little toy. So they finally Sunday morning come around, and we went all over the barnyards and every place. There was nothing, and we fired it up. We sent those, anything that was burning, we fired that up. We didn't have any coal or corn cobs like that, and we got it going. And I remember there'd been a lot of rainy weather, and it was early in the spring, and so we got it steamed up all right. We got the water and everything in it, so it didn't blow up, and we took off right down to the barnyard. I wanted to move it anyway from the north side of the house. I figured to put it down in the barnyards. So we drove it around the barn a few times, and they went around several times. The thing was working pretty good, out through the hog pastures and cow yard and that, and we were running it around. And finally, anyway, I found out that there was a whistle on the damn thing, so I started blowing this whistle. was about 10:30 in the morning, and finally woke my dad up. He was up late Saturday night running his clone, and he said, "What the hell is going on out there?" To my mother, and she says, "Well, the boys are moving that steam engine." He said, "They are?" Well, I didn't know they could run that. Yeah. So they took off. He looked out the window, and geez, we were just driving around back of the barn, and we come right around the corner. In front of the barn is a big manure pile. So Dan said, "Let's just push that big pile of horse manure and stuff right on ahead." Well, what happened, he ran right up there and started pushing, and when the big back wheel got over the middle of this manure pile, we got stuck right there. And it was right in front of the barn. There's a haymow door above it. And here, I was blowing a whistle in all the excitement. I was only about 11 years old. And my dad looked out the window, and he saw all this fire going out of the chimney, burning posts and that. And he said, "Them guys must be crazy." He said, "They're going to burn that damn barn down." And yeah, that wheel was just turning around and around, and slipping through this manure. And we had to stop it, and then they tied our chain down a post and something. They got out of there. But he come down there and he said, "Jesus Christ," he said, "we won't have no fence post or nothing else by the time you guys get done." But they were all just old wood and stuff. But I remember that, and then we drove it over and backed it up over the side of another barn and let her cool off, and that was the big steamer. But I'd laugh. Another time I come home from school, and my brother's always trading for something, and he had a picture of big Jack breeding mule on the wall in his real estate office, and he says, "That's what we ought to have on the farm." So anyway, he met some guy, said he had a big Jack, just like that one, and that's where he got the picture. He said, "That's the Jack right there. I'll trade it to you for something." I don't know what he traded for it, but he got this Jack. Well, I remember I come home from school, and this party had come and brought this mule, but you ought to see it. I said to Mom, I said, "Where'd you get that little colt out there?" And she says, "Well, that's a fella told me." He says, "That belongs to your brother Jim. He traded for it, and that was a Jack." I said, "The Jack? Hell, I said, that ain't much bigger than a big Jack rabbit. That great big ears, bigger than prospector burrows is what it was." So I went out there and just to look at him, and he looked around. He was just as gentle as could be, and put my hand on him. I noticed he didn't bother, nothing bothered him, so I leaned over his shoulder, and he didn't care, and I got on him. So I found out I could ride him, so I untied him and took a ride. Went up on the west end of our farm with him just for a ride, trying him out. And anyway, as I gone, Jim finally come home. He said, "The guy stopped." He said, "Where's the mule at?" He said, "He just went over." He said, "Art's riding me." "Art's riding him." He said, "Phil, that mule, sell him that great big mule." He says, "It ain't a big mule. He's right down the back of the barn now, coming around the corner." And I come around the corner, and Jim says, "Oh, no," he said, like a gee whiz. That guy put a fast one on me. So anyway, why? He says, "Well, I think as long as Art's got him, I might as well just give him to Art, because hell, nobody will ever want him." But I remember that mule, we had him around there for 4 or 5 years, and I remember my dad says, "Well," he says, "you got that Jack?" He says, "Maybe you'll get a mule, breed that mule to old Dolly, and you may get a good work mule out of him." So I remember he told Dan and John to take that Dolly and breed her, and they did. And a while later on, one day we went down the barn, and here this old Dolly was a great big horse, and here she had a little mule colt that couldn't even hardly reach up to suck. She'd have to kind of squat while he was sucking. But that was the Jack. Well, at the same time, this Jack we were farming the East Farm down in Danware. He'd done with. They had 2 tents. One they'd sleep in. They had a couple of beds in one, and they'd tuck in the other one. And they had a bunch of dinner cases they used to put the food in, because if they didn't, the dog could tear the lid off of anything else, and that's where they put their bacon and eggs and all their food. But anyway, this one day my mother said, well, I had a homemade cart that I used to, with a pair of shafts and a buggy axle and wheels, and I finally got a hold of one of them big bread boxes like they used to ship bread out of town by railroad from town to town from these bakeries. It's a big one, and they just fit it in between the shafts on this axle. I fastened that on, and that had a big lid on the top. So this big lid, you could open it and flop it clear back, and put all these, anything into the hall. That's what I had at first, to go out so I could haul junk in. And so my mother says, well, she says, why don't you and Margaret, John and Dan been out there a week now on that east farm across from Hutchison's farm. Why don't you go on out there and take this groceries out there with John and Dan and them? Because they'll need it by now. So anyway, I said, okay. I thought, geez, we're just another freighters. We could do that. So Margaret and I, we had all the stuff loaded up, and we could go out one way by the depot and then ride straight east, and then that was one way. It wasn't any way, and then we'd come back another road. After we'd get out there, we could go and come back on the other road. There was north by Tish's road, and that other one down Hendrick. On that road, come in by Ninemaker. Again. And that trip was about, I'd say about 9-10 miles, about a 10-mile trip out and back. We started out there, and that Jack was so damn slow, If he saw a team of horses ahead, this old Jack, he would liven up. He'd step it right off, until he'd get up to them. And then we'd whip him on by and go on again, and pretty soon, he'd start slowing up again. He'd just move along like a turtle at times. So I said, hell, we'll never get out of there. I said, Margaret, you win it like a horse, and maybe you'll get going. And once in a while, she'd make a noise like, winning like a horse, and geez, he'd step right along there. But pretty soon, I think he got wise to that, because he'd start slowing down. Well, I had this buggy whip made out of a willow, and I used to slap him over the rear end, but that didn't seem to bother him. He'd do anything. Margaret said, give it to me, I'll make him go. Margaret's about 3 years older than him, and she took this whip, and she just grabbed him in the rear end, and geez, that made him mad, and he kicked with both feet. He's come goddamn unloading that basket and everything else there, and was grabbing all. But then we kicked the square off of the thing, and so anyway, we cut that out, but we did get home. But it took us a damn day's job just going 9 miles a day. It was just doing something different. That's how time kept going on. It didn't cost very much to live in them days because we didn't have no electric light bills or water bills. We had kerosene lamps pump out in the back. All you had to do is work the pump handle and get your water, and outdoor toilets, no plumbing to go haywire, because we always had plenty of toilets, because every time Bob bought a building off of someplace that had an extra toilet, so we used to set them around back in the farm. We had 3 or 4 toilets down around back of the barns, so we always had plenty of toilets. We had, like these people today have 3 bathrooms, we had 4 toilets on the farm. I can remember I had a no check that passed back, and I think it was in 1912, and it was the taxes on the Sloan building on Main Street, Redwood. And I remember that for 2 years, the tax on that was $12. So things were different then. And the town well was right in the middle of Main Street, right in the intersection, right in the middle. They had 3 wells that I remembered. They had one there, and they had another one that was up in the middle of the street where later on in years they put a flagpole down. It was up in the main part of the block where all the banks and the post offices today is Ketticoin and one of it. Then on the side street, where there was one alongside of the printing office. We had two printing offices, the Gregory Times Advocate and the Democrat. And we used to take the Advocate, and we'd get that every Thursday. That cost about $1.75 per year at that time. We also subscribed for the Omaha World Herald, and that was the time that Will Rogers used to have a section in that paper, and that was the first thing my mother would always read is Will Rogers and different things. Were pretty witty in what he had to say every day. I'll never forget the year that they built themselves a potato plant out of an old corn plant. They put a seat back of each wheel, and they had a box ahead of us, sit down, and we could pull these potatoes out and we plant them. Margaret sitting one side and me on the other. And we planted around 7 acres of in-band potatoes. And I can remember us going along and Margaret said, I'll show you how to plant potatoes like this. She would just rake them in there, And I'd laugh, later on. The stuff, they just looked like a roll of lead or some place where she'd do that. But she said, I'll show you how to get rid of the potatoes, and we did. But I remember we sold potatoes for around 25, 30 cents a bushel in them times. That's all we could get for them. And then we had to take it out and trade with the grocery stores where we sold them. They'd give us aluminum checks, some like 450 cents and $1.05. And I remember we had about maybe $100 of each from two stores, like the farmer's store on the corner, a guy named Wolf ran that, and another one, Woolheiser, ran another one up down south, and they used to buy from. We'd sell them enough that we'd get quite a few groceries, tips, and then we could take it out and trade as time went along. We had a real large space underneath our house. Well, I can't tell you exactly, but we had hundreds of bushels of potatoes that we put them down there, and towards spring, I remember they all got sprouting, and we were hauling them out and dumping them in the hog pens, and of course we had our sweet potatoes to plant again, but we never could plant that much after that. And one year I remember they planted about 7 acres of beans, double loaded. Planted these beans, and so when they all got ripe, of course we cultivated them all summer. When they were ripe and dried out in the fall, nobody wanted to pick them, but I pulled all them beans. And I remember at that time we'd thrash them out in a wagon box, throw them in a couple forks full, and beat them down, knock them out, and throw the hulls off. But we had a lot of beans that year. And I remember they sold a lot of them for about 6 cents a pound. We had all the beans we wanted, and we used to butcher real early in the spring, and we didn't have no refrigeration then like now. The only refrigeration in town was behind the saloon. They had a big ice house and that. But we didn't put up ice, we didn't have an ice house. But I can remember we used to make a lot of salt pork, and during the summer months, we'd have chicken fries, and we had ducks, and mostly chickens, and stuff like and field corn, and we always had plenty to eat and to drink. On our farm, we had quite a few cattle, and in the spring cows were having calves, some of them having trouble, and Dave used to be the veterinarian, and a lot of times she'd say, well, come on, Art, and help me, and we get a wire stretch, and we were pulling calves, pigs, and everything else. But she was the main veterinarian, and she done all the milking, mostly. She'd milk from 6, probably 7, 8, 10 cows at a time. But at that time, we always had all the butter we wanted. We never did sell any cream in them days. We just used it ourselves, what we had. And our hogs had all the extra milk and so forth. And I remember the old cream separator. We had one that was a big setter. You poured it all in, leave it in overnight. The next morning, you could, you had a glass on the side, you could see how much cream was on top of all this milk. And we used to take all that cream off, then the bottom we'd draw up we'd feed that to the hogs and the dogs and whatever wanted, chickens and all that. I also had another job every night after school. We'd come home, we had this big hog lot, and they'd feed them ear corn, and I used to, before they'd feed them every night, I'd go out there and rake all these corn cobs up, and they'd haul them up by tubfuls. I had a homemade cart, and I'd haul them up, and we had a big back porch, like a coal shed back for house, and we'd always put them in there. On a bad stormy weather, we didn't have to go out to get anything like that. We had it in this coal house and this cob house. We had plenty of the cobs. My mother had a big majestic range, and where we burned cobs and that. She baked every week, and we made all her own veg again, so forth. We had a real large table in our kitchen. We could feed as high as 20 if there were that many, but most certainly there never was less than 10, 12 people eating at a meal. And I can remember one time I was brought the dog at a lake, and we knew them Morgan fields. They homesteaded across the place. They'd come in once in a great while. But anyway, we happened to be out there, and we shot a bunch of them muskrats out of the lake. So we brought them home to skin them. The hides were worth about 80 cents a piece. I can remember Babe and I, we were cleaning, skinning. My mother saw them, and I said, these look just like cotton shells. Well, she said, in Chicago, they used to have them on some of them restaurants. We sold them, and I said, they did? And she said, yeah. She said, they call them marsh rats back there. And she said, yeah, they ate them. So anyway, I said, well, what's wrong with, why not us try it? Look at how nice that meat looks. It looks a little redder, though, than the cottontail. Babe said, well, why not? We'll cook them. And I said, sure. I said, I'm not afraid to eat them. And so Babe and I was cleaning them, and I think we had about a dozen of them that we cooked. And we cleaned them, and I remember I gutted them, I cut the tails off and gutted them, and I cut the tail off of this one. I think I didn't cut it quite back in far enough. Anyway, John saw them. What are you going to do with them? And I said, well, we're gonna cook it. He said, you're like hell. He says, I'm not going to eat any of them. And Ma says, you don't have to eat any of them. We got these cottontails, all kinds of them out there to eat. She says, so tomorrow, if he wants to, Babe and Art wants to eat them, I'll cook them up. Morgan Fields, they were there. So we figured we just didn't say nothing to them about it. There was a couple of them, and there was about 15 of us at the table, and Ma told Johnson, now, I'll put this rabbit right in front of you when we sit down, and you help yourself. See, and yeah. So anyway, we were all eating, and I was eating these marsh rabbits and muskrats, and they tasted about something on the order of cottontail. And so anyway, John was talking, and while he's talking, this plate of the rabbit got moved on, and geez, about the time he got done yakking, he got one of these some of these with a couple of these muskrats on it. And he took one, and he'd been eating there, and he'd laughing, talking, potatoes and gravy. And anyway, all at once, Jersey jumps up on the table and he beats. Never said a goddamn word. We said, what was the matter with him? But after a while, he said, he said, I come to this one. He said, you didn't cut that tail off. He said, I could tell what I was eating when I come to that. I said, you couldn't tell before, could you? Well, he said, you're cooking rats, the next thing you'll be cooking them snakes, too. I said, oh, hell, I said, they're all right. It's just your imagination. In October, they had some kind of a big celebration going on in Medway there. And I remember they had stands on the streets, and selling hot dogs and different things. And they had a sideshow that's across the street from my dad's saloon. And these guys were in the sideshow. They had a opium guy smoking opium, and they even had a 5-legged cow. And they had different pits, and they were canvas. And they had these big snakes and armadillos and these gilly monsters in one. This drug fiend was in the other smoking opium. And back in the end of it, they also had a 5-legged cow, and this cow's leg come out of her shoulder and hung down her side over her front hip, shoulder. And I remember a hell of a big snow come up, and that was the end of that celebration. And these guys just sit around town for 8 or 10 days. And I remember the damn big snake. They had a big snake that was about 7 foot long, a diamond rattler, a Texas one. And I remember it died, so the guy gave it to me, and we took it home, and we skinned it, and we stuffed it. And I remember it stitched around after we skinned it. It was about 7, 8 foot long. And we used to have it up against the wall on a board. And later on, we gave it to my Uncle Johnny in Chicago. We sent it to him. And then the show, they went broke there, and they were stranded there. And this tent was, about 24 foot wide, and it run clear back, about 45, 50 foot long. And I remember these guys were broken. My dad bought it, the big tent, and they had these big boxes with the canvas in, and I remember we brought them home, and the gilly monsters and all that stuff, we brought them home and put them in the basement. I remember one of the gilly monsters got out, and it disappeared. We never did find it. It got away. But later on, a couple of years later, there was a guy who was out in another county. He won the big tent for his horses there. I guess my dad sold it to him. He took it out, and about a month later, he come back, and he said a hell of a big wind come up, and it just blows that tent to ribbons out there. They had some awful big winds out in that open country up there by Todd County. Between our house and Main Street and Gregory, the Indians used to come in from the north with their Indian wagons, and they'd pull up alongside of these lots on the side road, grass there, and they'd unhitch their horses and tie them up, take them out, and then the old Indian would go up to Main Street, and then the squaw would put the tent up herself. He wouldn't even wait. And then later on, they'd come back, they'd have a little campfire out on the ground and cook their supper. And I remember they'd always have a dog or two tied behind their wagons to come in and go. One year, we had a water well on the corner of our farm, and we had a gate over there that so we could get in and out of there. And I remember I used to go over there and pump water, and I used to look over, I'd go over there and pump water, and geez, I'd look over there, and here's some Indian would be in there. Waters or some big old pot-bellied Indian. He wouldn't even touch the pump handle, and it made me so damn mad. I used to run over there, and I told him, I said, if you want to water the horses here, it's all right, but get on the pump handle. I just got done pumping this for the cattle. So I said, don't ever stop here again unless you want to pump that handle. I had quite a time getting the water, and then they'd come along and drink it all up. So I tried to stop that. I can remember looking over on the north side of town, and that north of our farm was a road that went to Dallas. Going up the line, and I remember you were up to Dick. I really kept our eye on them, because just then, as they, especially in the fall year when the roasting years, they would, just so they could get up there where that was, they'd be taken off into the cornfields and grabbing off those ropes in there. And I remember Dad used to take off on horseback with a shotgun and run the hell out of there and make them leave with sap right there. Time to get the hell out of there and blow their head off. So they'd take off and go on again. But we used to lose a lot of things by them stuff too. One of the bitches shops had a slaughterhouse right north of our farm, and I can remember they used to butcher these cattle and they'd throw all the guts right out on the ground. And I saw them Indians when I was a little kid. They're over there, they stopped there and they'd sit after bitching and they'd take them guts and they'd start cutting chunks of guts off and they'd go down to the watering troughs and they used to cut them off in lengths and turn them inside out and just wash them off in the trough. And then they'd go ahead and eat that raw, a lot of them. Some of them, then they take the rest of it along with them. But that's the first thing they wanted when they butcher beef, even an Indian on the reservation. The first thing they ate was the gut, and the rest of the meat was all cut up in little slips and hung on lines to dry, and that was jerk beef. They dry that out, so they'd have something to eat, but they put salt on it and hang it out and dry it good. Good. I remember we always had a phonograph to play, and finally anyway, we were all getting bigger, and then he ran for an office, a county office, to get an office, and he was in politics, and I remember a guy beat him, a guy named Charlie Oswald. Charlie beat Jim out of this office job, and Jim felt so damn bad, and he moved out of Gregory, and he went to Omaha, and this job only paid about $80 or $90 a month, that job working in the county. He went down there and he went into other businesses. He also had we used to take turn about playing with him. Mom said, well, don't fight over it. One at a time play it. And I remember I used to get a roll, something like 400 pie, you know. That wasn't very long roll, but Margaret, you know, just learning this. He grabbed this goddamn big roll as round as a toilet paper, and she'd put that thing, and it'd take about a half hour to run that through. But the best part of it is, at that time, they were just starting to try to dance there. And she met some kid, I guess he lived in Minor. But anyway, he was invited down, and I remember this evening he come down and there, and of course he came over to our place, and Margaret met him, and we all had an introduction with this big slim kid, and I don't know what the hell his name is, but anyway, in the front room they go, and so anyway, he said, oh, you've got to play your piano, and Margaret says, yeah, I'll play it for you. So anyway, she got on one of these kind of one of these hot pieces, a pretty fast piece, you know. We started playing in them days, you know, and like Oh Johnny. And anyway, this guy sat down in a rocking chair, and this damn rocker he was sitting, we pushed it back. It was not too far from the corner. One of the rockers was broke off of it. So anyway, we just set that back in the corner instead of out in the middle of the room. And so anyway, she's playing this damn piece, you know. He moves this, just kind of drags the rocking chair away from the wall, and he was sitting there and she's pumping it, you know, and the thing was clanging away, you know, and this kid got rocking and he rocked back where this rocker was broke off, and Jesus, oh, what? Why in the hell of a noise? And I looked in there and the damn rocking chair rolled over backwards and he rolled out the corner. But I never will forget that. He was so damn bashful. He didn't stay very long. He finally took off for town. Well, around about 4th of July was coming along, and I remember this one farm that had a lot of corn planted on sod. It had another farm. We didn't have no fence stuff. So anyway, we'd have to herd these cattle and watch them. And so on 4th of July, I remember they gave us 2 bits apiece.
We each had our own riding horse. We all had our riding horses in that family. And I remember we each went uptown, and we were together. We rode up there, and we got about 2 bits worth of jawbreakers apiece. They were big red ones, about as big as a quarter, and there's a few black ones, mixed, different flavors, but they mostly taste like root beer. And I remember we'd take a couple gallons of water, and we'd go over to herd these cattle, these all the day, over there. And I remember we'd have a run a race, see who the hell could get rid of one of them the quickest of jawbreakers, sucking on them. And then the next time we'd shoot say, all right, let's see who can make one last the longest. So I remember, I said, okay, the first whoever lost would have the jawbreaker steak. So I remember what she did. She got that damn jawbreaker in her mouth, but she put it between her teeth. She wasn't even sucking on it. So she beat me on that, see, and I finally caught on. But that was our experience of having horses that served with something them days, with these horses. I can remember one time I had a little mare, and I put a saddle on her. I was going to go after these cattle across town, and I remember the damn cinch. I didn't have it, the cinch set up just quite right. And I remember that we just about got home, and I never did tighten it, cinch tight on the horse. And this damn saddle, she kind of ran off the edge, and the cattle rolled right around her. Of course, I rolled off, and the horse did run away and finally took the saddle off, got it off, and I got home all right. One day when I was around the yard, I was out there, and my dad, he always had a big garden of potatoes right out in front of the house, big garden. And we were out there hoeing these potatoes and knocking potato bugs off in cans and so forth. And I remember this guy must have gone in the yard before we noticed him, and he come leading this big buckskin horse from the barnyard right up past the house. And my dad says, hey, he says, where the hell do you think you're going? He said, and this guy's name was Cerny. And he says, my name is Cerny. I just brought this horse, this buckskin horse off of Ferguson. He says, Ferguson? You bought that horse? Not that horse. Ferguson's got a buckskin horse, but it's not that one. You don't have the right horse. Oh, yes, he said, I bought this horse. He said, you did like hell, and he gave her a shove of this hole. He said, you better let go of that rope or I'll cut your head on this hole. And so anyway, my dad go back and get that. I don't want the damn thing anyway. It's nothing but just eating the hay up, so you can get it. So I walked down with him, and he put a halter around this other old horse and took it out of there because we didn't want it anyway. It belonged to Ferguson. This farm of ours is about a mile long, and we used to have the cattle clear out back, in the cornfields. Driving them around. And finally one day we could, these cows, if one cow ever goes to a fence, the whole damn herd goes. So anyway, we were just looking out north of our place, and here's this road that comes down from west of our farm. Here come a guy driving a whole herd of cattle down the road. My dad, geez, that looks like our cattle. Look at that old spotted one there, He said, I know it's our cattle. So he told John and Dan, and the guy had enough guts, it was over safety. And he had enough guts where he made his mistake. If he was taking them in, to put them in the pond, he should have went right straight on the other way. But he had to drive right in front of our house. Maybe he didn't know they were our cattle. But anyway, John and Dan ran out, and as he's driving these cattle on, they just herded them right up our lane, right into our yard. And so, but he had a rope, he was going to belt one of them with it. He says, you kids, what the hell do you think you're doing? And my dad, he beat it down there, and he told him, he says, he had a gun. He says, you back up, or he says, I'll blow your damned head off. He says, them are my cows. Oh, he says, they were all over in my pasture. He says, over in my cornfield. And he says, I'm going to take them into the closet. He says, you are like, you get the hell out of here while you're all together. But anyway, that was what happened to the turkey. Learn West is hanging out there at our place. They're just for people that come up from Nebraska and live in town, never had nothing to do, and half starved. He used to eat over at our place sometimes. Came around John and Dad, he probably stay over there most of the time. And I can remember one fall we hung around there, and they were going out to Dog Ear Lake to cut hay. And he liked John and Dan, and anyway, John, Dan, gave him a little to meet him, and I remember that they got out of that end. They were loading up, they loaded on his mother machines, they stuff up these wagons, and so they wouldn't have to come behind them. Their tents and everything, and they're just getting ready to take off. They were going out the front gate. Why, Darn looks over there, and he had a team of horses. They just tied him behind one of the other hay racks. And anyway, why, he says, I'm going to take a run for it. And he runs a mile west. He says, I'll meet you out there when you get out that far. He saw his mother coming and his big brother. So he wanted to go, and he figured they'd get home, and he wouldn't get to go. He was about 17 or 18. And so anyway, Mrs. West came up there, and she said, my mother said, hello, Mrs. West. She says, I want Fern. I want Fern. And she says, well, I don't. She says, well, Fern, is he outside there? Is the rest of the boys? No, he's not out here. And she says, I want him to come home. Well, she says, what about him going along out there with them boys to cut hay? I don't want him to go out there. I don't want him to go anywhere. I want him to stay home. So anyway, why, she got mad, and she told my mother and I was standing there, and she said, now I want to tell you something, Mrs. Flynn. If Fern goes to the dad, I'll blame your boy. But you couldn't blame Fern for wanting to go there. He had plenty to eat, and that's what he was after. But every year or two, my mother'd want to go back, take a trip, back to Chicago, which she was back to where her mother lived in New Hartford. Of course, my dad was in Chicago. He went back to run the saloon again. So he ran the saloon back there, and my mother was half the time in South Dakota and half the time in Chicago. The tickets in them days run around $16 one way, and she would go back to Chicago. So this time, why, we had pool tables and bowling alleys and everything spread out in some of our big farms. When she went away, we set a pool table up, my brother did, in the living room. And I remember when she started seeing and I had found those different things tonight. Like those grass on all these different ones. That run around, they'd come over there and play something to make them even. Sometime at 1 o'clock in the morning, they'd have a pool game going on. And, they'd stay right there, right getting ready to eat eggs and everything. Just trying to let out the eggs. If we were short of food, all we had to do was rock a few chickens and swimming and cook this. There was different ones, but Mr. Jones was Duffy. Bill Duffy, and they would come out in the fall year and hang around all winter, So while they were there, one of them, they wrote a letter to his cousin. He says, come on out. We got this big house, this big basement. Anyway, he come right out there one night, and the train come in, and he walked over to our place. He found out people directed him and lived right west of town. And so anyway, we had a big cellar door on the south side of our house that opened up. It was right under another door that was upstairs. door that we used to open up just for air in the summer, but the cellar door, get on the basement right under this door. Well, then somebody left this door open in the basement, this basement cellar door. This one to keep the snow out was left open, but the other one in the basement was closed. But anyway, this night this kid come along and, from Chicago. He walks up to knock on the door, and of course, this doorway was all blown full of snow, and the basement steps going down. And he walks right up, and geez, he goes out of sight. He ends up down in there about 5 foot of snow. These guys hung around down winter. Then about time spring comes, why they all took off, warm weather, took off to go different directions, like going home. And so anyway, why about a month later, this Duffy's old man wrote a letter to my dad. He wanted to collect for Joe's wages. Hell, there was nothing for him to do out there all winter but to eat.
Okay.
So my dad had made him mad, so he just goes up and he gets an attorney, a friend of his named McDonald. He make out a bill of this guy back, and he said, "Oh, I'm just make it out like I'm telling you, because you sent it to him." So he made out this bill to Duffy, says, "Your son was out here, and I fed him and kept him all winter. Now I want to collect for board and room." Back McDonald fixed it up. So anyway, there was 2 printing offices in our town, and there was 4 livery barns, and there was 7 saloons, and there was 7 churches, and all up and going, living off of a population. I think about that time it was about 1,000 population in that town. 3 doctors that big, and there was Doc Johnson and there was Doc Ahern. But Doc Johnson, he was the only one that had any kind of they never had no hospital at all, just doctors, and if you had something wrong with your hand or that, why he wonder sometimes you could go to his office. Most of the time he'd come to the house. John had a broken leg one time. A horse fell on him, and Doc Johnson came over there and he set his leg. But I remembered after his leg all healed up, John had one leg that was about 3/4 of an inch shorter than the other. He set the leg about 3/4 of an inch short. John always limped after that. Doc Johnson had this big old building that looked like an old hotel, and had a bunch of rooms upstairs over this hotel, and all these different women that were in the family were girls from even up in the next county. They'd be down there upstairs. And a friend of ours by the name of Hayes says, "Well," he says, "it's lambing season again. Doc Johnson's got a full house up there." Dr. Ahern, he used to buy milk animals. We used to sell milk and sell it by the gallon. 25 cents a gallon to deliver it over to his house. So that's what it cost in them days. And he was a pretty good doctor, but later on in years, him and his wife both were using dope. They both of them went out of town broke.
So, you know how long it takes to pay that.
Back in them times, you could buy a good riding horse for around $50 to $60. And to buy a milk cow was worth around $50. Butter used to cost around 25 cents a pound, and cakes probably 12 cents. And buy a loaf of bread for about 8 cents. And a sack of flour, 48-pound sack of flour, cost you $1.50. Sugar was about 5.5 hundred. Buy a pair of overalls for 75 cents, and a good shirt would cost you about 55 cents. When I first started at school, I had school on Main Street. They just like store bill. Then later on, they built schoolhouse. And I can remember a teacher I had, her name was Evans, and she taught 4 different grades. They never had no kindergarten. Then they had first grade, second grade, third, fourth. And she had all 4 of them herself. Then later on, why, there was finally got down so teachers would handle 1 grade. And that was besides that. It didn't matter how many kids, if there was 100 in the room, they would all be, she'd teach them all. But I can remember being in 1 grade, she's on another grade teaching them, but seemed to work out all right then. School teachers back in them times were getting around $50 to $60 a month for teaching a class. We were the only ones in town that had a monkey. And anyway, this teacher found out that we had this cut monkey in. So she knew that most of these children in school never did see one. So one Friday, this teacher told Margaret asked her if she would bring the monkey to school so the children could see this monkey. So anyway, she asked Ma would it be all right to take Jocko, the monkey, up there, and she said, "Oh, sure." So anyway, she takes this monkey up there, but before they took him up there, they had a little red jacket on and a little cap, you know, and they had this line up, little chain on him, and Margaret led him along, and he run along there, you know, we takes him up to school, and we get to the school, and of course, all these kids are waiting there, all these deaf, so Margaret, she leads them in, and of course, he looks so comical, you know, jumping around on this line, and so pretty soon, why, he quieted down pretty well, and they were all looking, you know, at this monkey. And so they says, this teacher said to Margaret, "Why don't you just turn him loose and let him just see what he does, go around?" And she snapped him and let him loose, and he was going around and looking around, the kids all laughing, getting a big bang out of it. Finally, anyway, there was an organ sitting in the corner, and had a big mirror sitting up on this organ, and this mirror didn't even have a frame on it, just a big piece of plate glass in here. So anyway, this monkey jumping around, he jumped up on the organ, he saw this mirror up there, and he thought he saw another monkey, and he jumped into it, and the damn mirror started falling. So when it started falling, he made a jump, he lit on the floor, you know, suddenly lit on the floor, and the damn mirror comes down and cut his tail right off from his rear end. He had his stuff in it. This monkey, he just goes wild, and he runs all over the school making an awful noise. The kids were scared to death. The monkeys run to one window trying to get out, and another one, and I remembered, he jumped up and tried to get out of this window, and he grabbed this big shape, and he let go, and it went up and went bang, and the teacher got all excited and opened the damn schoolhouse door, and the monkey out he went, and he headed right straight home. And Margaret, she didn't know if she better go home or not. After this monkey going home with this little short tail. But anyway, it was all fixed up anyway. But that was a good one there. And I can remember that monkey used to sit with my dad and come home from tending bars slow, and he'd sit in his chair, and this monkey used to come right over there and sit down alongside him on the floor, you know, and he'd kind of rub up against my dad's leg. My dad used to scratch that tail of his sticking out, you know, like his monkey'd look up, you know, like he really enjoyed that. But I got a kick. My dad would sit down, he'd start reading the newspaper, and he'd be reading it while this monkey was sitting on his shoulder. My mother used to say, "Look in the other room at Robinson Crusoe, there he is with his monkey." But I can remember one time we was watching him, this damn monkey got excited, he just jumped and whatever, he hit that damn paper and took it right out of my dad's hands, you know, when he was sleeping. And another time, my mother got out a stick of candy when she was about 5, 6 years old, and she was throwing it on the front porch, and this monkey was looking up at her, and she was sucking on it, just then. there. He was kind of chatting around. She didn't know what he was chatting about. Pretty soon all of what this monkey gives a big leap and he hits her and she falls on his back and her mouth flew wide open and this monkey had to stick a candy and away he went. Took off for the barnyard. He used to hang around with the dogs and when you throw them out something to eat, you know, he'd always like potatoes and that. My mother tossed him a red hot potato, boiled potato, the peel and got right out of the kettle. He grabbed that thing and the damn hot, he just bent from one hand to the other. He went down and put the sauce in it, and he just kicked off the back and forth like a guy juggling a ball until it cooled off, and then he'd get the peeling off, and then he'd eat it. He just about liked to eat anything, but he never liked raw meat. Dogs of beef, that he called attempt to, but he never gets to stand meat that wasn't cooked. In the summertime, early in the mornings, just about daylight, he'd go out. We had a telephone pole in front of the house. He used to climb that telephone pole and he'd sleep back. You'd hear the wires rattling on the side of the house, making a tune. And pretty soon they come down with a big high power line down the front of our place, 50 per gallon. One of these big high voltage lines, 3 wire. So when they put that in, right away, got a chain, a big chain, and put it on those brothel, and we'd hook him on the clothesline, and then he'd run back and forth from one end of the clothesline to the other, and finally one day, he ran the hole out to that ring was on the clothesline wires, going back and forth, and he went up on the tie line, fell through the top, ran over one of our powered wires, and put all the lights out, brown, and fire line next to the house, burned his feet and hands and back, and kill him, but we had to shoot him later on. I remember the day they shot him by my dad, hands were full of maggots, they were burnt so bad he never could use them. So they took him out behind the death grave for him, but anyway, this fellow took him back to the barn and shot him and put him in his hole back there in back of the grave, and they buried him. That was the last of him. Found out this monkey from a stonekeeper in Wood, South Dakota. He had 2 of them, and they were always fighting, so he felt sorry for this smaller one, so he told my dad he could take him if he wanted to, and called us, if you like him. And my dad said, well, I'll take him. So anyway, we brought him home. He was quite a deal around our place. We never needed any circuses there because there was always one going on. And also, I remember in the winter time when we had a big hog house, we had a bunch of pens out there for these old sows, and I was going to have pigs where they'd be penned up in each pen. We had about 24 of them out in this hog house. But I remember it had a bunch of windows in it, about small windows. And anyway, one of the little windows was knocked out. That was just right for him. He could go in there and out all winter. And anytime he'd be outside, and if he couldn't get into our house, he'd head down there and he'd jump up on the roof and he'd go through this window. And many a time I walked in there, just slipped in there, you know. All these sows were laying around in their pens, and he would be laying right up against their tits, you know, to keep warm. He'd get between their legs and one of their tits, and he'd lay there and be looking out, you know, where it was nice and warm for him. One time Margaret and I were walking out back of our farm there, and of course this monkey, he was down as well with the weather. He had one of the pieces of cans with them trailbreakers in his mouth, and I had one. We were walking along, and he was fine. he was traveling along behind us there, running along. Put his son out of it, give a hell of a leap. He jumped up on his shoulder, and he said, "Well, jumped back home." One time my mother was scrapping the brush out of broom and water, and we had this hard maple flying, and she just take a little rye on that, you know, let it dry walk in, and I was bring it right in. So she just stuck a lie there, and then let it set a while, and then pretty soon she come back and pour a little water on it, hot water, and then rest it, see. But I'd have this monkey come along, and he was pretty sneaky. He could just come right up and take a hold of the screen door, and he could just pull that open and slip in there. So he used to do that, you know, and I was looking around, you wouldn't dare leave a sugar bowl on the table. He'd make a loop, and he'd go up there and grab the hand of the sugar and do it again. But anyway, this time he come in, you know, and he sat down and with his sprinkler was lying. All at once, he jumped up and he swung around and usually ran out the back door, screeching, and he slid out his behind, across the yard, heading for the barnyard. He took the cloud of dust off the, in the wintertime, sometimes we get down to 25, 30 below zero. Of course, we had a small cage that was built out of this chicken netting. It was all about 3-4 foot square, and we used to bring him in, and we'd put him in this cage back in the corner so that he wouldn't freeze to death, but he didn't have much hair on him. And anyway, we also, I remember we had this ferret. My dad had a ferret when we go hunting the house. We'd take it out back of the buttes. And I used to carry this ferret. I was around 10 years old. And we'd walk around the hole we could stuff the ferret in, and we'd put him in there, and my dad would stand back with the shotgun, and he'd hear these rabbits coming out of it. His ferret would run him out. So of course, if he had a top one, why, he'd just stuck the butt out of them, and he'd lay down and go to sleep. So many a time we'd have to plug a hole and look around that there wasn't other holes where he could get out either, because we may lose him. And he was, any place he could get his head, he could get in. But I remember this time the monkey, my dad had this ferret, and poor weather never bothered him, and we kept him in a big wooden rain barrel on that back porch, that back of our house, and allowed us to crawl in there, and how we'd go out there for a little bread and milk, you know, and just put it down there and feed him. But this morning was just folded in the house, so he thought he'd bring it in just in the house, so we could see it. We fed that thing in the house, but I remembered after he got done eating mine, he ran along the wall and around, and pretty soon he ran up to where the monkey's cage was, and it was one of these big round nuts, a pretty good size opening, and he just goes right in, and all at once we could hear a hell of a screeching in there. And the monkey, he had this ferret right by the neck. I remember that. And so we had to get the door open quick and get him loose from the ferret. The ferret would really go after him too, but he had the ferret, so he had that was right around his neck, and the ferret couldn't even. He was squirming like hell, like a big angry worm, and getting loose, and then he'd come back at him again, and then they'd drag him out. One time, Bob brought the bar home and stayed overnight. Broke boy, the next morning, the brown rolled up and left up and heard something looking at him. He was on the bedpost looking down. Just got his thread in his throat. What the hell was think of was real, and he found out his wife. After that, he stayed dead. Potatoes and baby. You just don't really don't get down with nothing. Anyway. But that's I rock for the right job. First thing we always bring somebody different home now and then, and finally got acquainted with a colored guy. This guy's name was Oscar Newsom, and he was a homesteader down south by Carlock. And while he was putting his homestead years there, he wrote a book while he was around about the homesteader was the name of it. And he gave my dad one of these books later on after he had it published. But I don't know how he ever made out with the book, but I suppose there's a few of them around yet. But we did have one at one time. He was a well-dressed colored guy. And the year that talking about is about 1913. So that background, I remember there was one other colored guy. I remember I did the her name was good, and I remember the house, and it was, I didn't feel it. But he married down himself, and I I can remember we went over there, and they lived in a sad house. That was a sad house, and that too, because that was down there too. My friend Kipcar was went out by Tralee Lake, a party by the name of Mabel. Rose was telling me that she was there 4 or 5 years ago. But Miss Mabel is still alive, but she's a real old woman. But this time was not colored party at 6,000. She was definitely really what I was that was as well as it is. I can remember so we go in there, because the U.S. is, well, how are you on that? Oh, well, I was going to the last night's house, and I was going to look out the laugh and away. He was something out of that was the second part of it. Then there was a couple of better people around graduates. The half one, he was a predator, quick reason. Winters on a stove on the corner. He had a coat guard lifting a little strap behind his shoulder. And I was back there. And my brother Ken survived that shot. Very more. And I can remember very more. I don't realize this guy is going to drive over there and get my hair cut. I don't have time to touch you around. So good, man, don't have fun. No, I remember at that time the pastor said, I think it was a girl would get a haircut, and if the guy would get a shave, it was either 10 or 15 cents to get a shave and then lose. But, and I remember this, there wasn't very many times South Dakota, with the livestock, with the path, stove, and everything, southbound, half the stops have right. They drive to the water, finish the cow, and half. Many times I run up the driver's shop, that's what it is. But, he had the family house in Frank Robbins. Frank Robbins, of course, he had roulette wheels in there, and they would play cards or any kind of a game you wanted to play. He was a professional gambler. I remember he was a friend of my dad's, and I remember one time they were running out of town. Richard was going to win them, so my brother was there. They went up there at night, the wagon, and they brought home all these games. He got 2 roulette and about 2 great big range bags, which were bigger than bunnies, full of poker chips. then we know the boys bed. I remember we used to get food in poker here. We'd make a whistle, eat and then put a couple bowls, put them around, and whistle. This Robin Salter, this gambler, also had some pictures of making wine in Italy, you know. They showed these style Italian girls who were in these big wine baths, walking around, dressing the grapes barefooted. He had a couple of big pictures of them, great big ones. And of course, after he didn't know what to do with these pictures, so he took them over to Billy Moore, this colored guy's barbershop. And luck to have it, why he had him in. First, the colored guy, he didn't realize that he thought that was picked up on it. But anyway, why he had a fire, and then pretty soon, you know, got all straightened up again and cleaned up, and by God, here he has another fire. So anyway, he got thinking that maybe he had bad luck. So anyway, why, one day I was in the haircut. After he had a fire and he got cleaned up, the joint all cleaned up. Yeah. What they used to have is he brought in the back with a gasoline making burner. The tank was up on an iron pipe, 3-4 foot over these burners. There'd be 2 burners. And we had 2 or 3 of them stoves. My dad had them for his pet camping, you know. And you didn't need pressure in them at all. It was just pour the gas in and gravity feed. You'd turn the burner on. Little gas. I didn't want to get warm. But it was just a second gasoline. So anyway, this stove got away from him a couple times and got crossed the fire. And I was sitting there, and some guy with another party, he was cutting his hair, you know. And pretty soon everybody'd come by, you know, would look to see what the hell the fire did. It's fire in bed again, so it was an old fast. Anyway, why, she come along, he looked in the window, and he saw her looking at him. He really got his brother. He says, "My Lord, get out of that black man." He says, "Well, he keeps looking in here." He said, "I was just looking at that fire wall." He said, "I wouldn't go out with her." He said, "I'd rather have my thing in a red hot stove than in her." He said, "I wouldn't get burned any worse." I never forget that. I was a kid about go back. No, so then I marathon after that, I remember I got a face up there on the blast. That's the last I could stop me from there, you know, and tell me what he was doing. If I ever come to Omaha to destroy and stop and see him. Not this time, my dad, that was my mother, she's running, that's very, alone. Anyway, I went back. But, because we figured my mother, so we goes back. I was school. First thing I met some of these fish on there. But I went to these schools before, but forgot for 2 or 3 years and come back. You got to fight 3-4 kids before you know that they'll let you alone. I can remember this woman that woman's restaurant on the television. So Sarah, she gave me a coat. This damn coat was big enough to put a kid in it. 5 years older than I am. And I remember the street from down there to that, and that, anyway, and I school in that, after everybody took me to school, and I moved to that school, and I was nothing to Bill Irving. Bill Irving that. This was back in very little. And it wasn't like today, everybody knows everything. Well, you know, that was the matter with you. That's rather small. And we'd have to work all day, do something, and Georgia, we had a man's work for a 12-year-old. But these kids now, the two folks handing $1, there's stuff at their parents. But what their parents would do is knock their ears down a little bit, and they'd make bigger checks on it. I find out that these kids, that their parents are not calling that. I have never saw one yet that ever amounted to that. The ones that really turned out good, the ones that stick paper out, they earn their own money, but they pay their own way. And they're the ones that can help them with it. They know what a dollar is. And when they're giving, so these children are giving everything to you like they are, they don't amount to. They always figure somebody's going to help you. They don't really fit any good they give them. They're better more. But I know without learning, even if he has anything, he knows what a dollar is. But one day, I later only got a couple dollars a day. Because I know, I went through there. My folks were never poor or anything like that. Talent are that. And we saw this, that's where we get our spending money, the buy stuff. I even traded stuff, you know, for I knew a guy, there's a German from the old country. I used to sell him lead stuff when I did that. So I remember I traded enough lead to get out of them. Combination. Very radical in our world of the house. That's the difference that God has today. Getting back to this kid that had the roller skates is Bill Irving and his brother, you know. One day one would use the skates and the next day the other one would use the skates. Anyway, this one night after school we was walking along and this Bill had this pair of roller skates. And his brother come running up and he wanted the skates. He said, it's my day to use the skates. And this is when last night, I know, it was supposed to be mine, but you had the skates last night using them. So I figured, as long as you used them last night, I would use them today. And he said, no, today is supposed to be my day. And he started hollering around and a bunch of kids ran up. And I remember these kids were a bunch of, as we say, get the hell kicked out. So anyway, one kid said, I'll get the skates, and he ran up, you know, and he was going to hit me. I didn't have it. But I had the roller skate key, and I had it right between my fingers. The point was stuck out right between my two round fingers, and I had my fist covered up, and the back of the key was in the back of my head. And so when he ran up, I stepped up and it was really bad, you know. So I swung on him, and I caught him right over the right eye. The key went, just cut a groove over right above his eye, straight back to the top of his head. Looked like a rat squirrel, and he went down, he fainted. And it scared me, I thought I'd killed him, so I started running like hell. I run, and I finally went in the back of the kitchen restaurant and down in the basement. So anyway, about an hour later, here come a kid along, and later, and he says, you know, Art, he says, this kid, he says, that you get, he said, he's all right. The time they took him over to a doctor somewhere, but I don't know that he walked in. He's all right. I said, I thought I'd kill him when I saw that hanging loose in his feet on the floor. So I said, they'll never bother you anymore. I heard him talking, what you hit him with. One of them said, he must have had a big little ring or something where he cut his head. They never bothered me after that. I didn't have to fight anymore. Along the path, my folks right back out to South Dakota. That down that kind of thing, one of those was John or Dan would come back. They'd stay a couple of weeks. And then they go back. I think that's happened in our Western area. It's always something like that train going back and forth. One day, whole ferry about 50 down. It was that, and I remember that that was the 1815. They had all the damn snow. They had busy the goddamn railroad from all Nebraska right started to go. There was for a week sometimes there wasn't a train would come in. When the most generous at that time there were 2 trains a day that used to come in. Used to be a train that come in right after, about 2 o'clock, and then in the evening there was another one about 7:30 at night. And there was a lot of freight trains, and everything was running good. And I remember that they had a snowplow. I still have a picture of it. There was an open, big open patch where you went between the hill with a couple of railroad tracks down. And it was full of solid with snow, and that was just rubbery snowplow. And well, it took them days to get up as far as Dallas and Winter. Snowbanks every here and there. A big snowbank, and they'd, even some of them had a bunch of cattle that got in with the message, and then there was some stuff. The snow would come along and a big fan of it, spraying bones and cows and everything else. Such snowbanks. I remember there was a guy from Dallas who was taking a picture off one of these snowbanks. The damn snowbank dropped his nose, that fell down so deep. And the snow was 15, 18 foot deep in some of them open cuts. We'd run into them several times, bogging away, and having hell of a time really get the experience on. But they finally made it. Got it open. I remember that next spring again after school got, I was back to South Dakota, and this time, and then I remember it's the next spring and summer, that when the wheat and stuff all was really getting ripe, in July, and later part of July and August, that we had so much rain that there was lake floods out in the wheat field. And one day you had to go and miners with the horse that was done by the power of the snow on the ground. And we never was trying everything to power to run it. We even tried to rake up the gas and they had the right. So I remember we bought an engine, a foot an engine that was paid to Lincoln the gas that weighed 150 pounds, and I remember afterwards he said, well, it weighed 150 pounds, and the cost was 50 pounds. It was $1 a pound is what that engine cost in the day. But we could use that engine for several other things. We used to use it to run our wash. That was about the power wash. Yeah. Flying the fan, this thing is all fucking fast, and that goes on back to the pond again. The road, that's where folks have been shot down. They were on the time. And I went to school in Chicago, the Mount Greenwood School for a while. First they sent me to St. Margaret's, over on 99th. But we had to get on a streetcar to go over there. And them sisters over there, the damn mean, they used to beat the hell out of us with rubber hose. So anyway, I wouldn't know it. Yeah, I see that. I got going. So, okay, going out to Mount Greenwood School, that's where I went. And I got along pretty good at Mount Greenwood School. And I liked it. Met the Highlanders there and that, but I never had no trouble there after hitting this one foot nearly scalping. That's straighten them things out. I never had no trouble after that. I remember pretty soon, my dad always too, you run this drone, and there was always different characters hanging around. I remember one time there, he had this water hungry, he thought he's a kind of a suit, and he would go around from one saloon to the other, and he'd hang out any damn place that he'd stay. And so anyway, that's the basement our daughter room, and he would go around there and he'd do things, and he'd fed them, and they'll go in and out of the basement. This one day, I had a trapdoor. My dad had a short way of going to the basement. In case he'd be alone there, he had a trapdoor he could open. He could go right straight down, about 10, 12 foot deep there, right down in the basement by the beer vault where he had all his beer on tap. We had this craft beer. So I had to go down there to see about 10 barrels of beer. And get something out of it. This day, Waller, he was roasting the ground down. He went down there and he opened his trap door and dried up. And over there, after he about 20 days, snow, my dad was talking to the guy, and my dad went to back up to the car and something like that. Stepped into the snow. He fell down and he broke some ribs on the doorway. Right to him with a monkey. I think one of the actors him kind of punched his lung because after that, he couldn't hardly walk. He could walk for miles and miles hunting. But after that cut him down. That bothered him so bad he couldn't hardly. It really slowed him right up because he couldn't hardly breathe. And if it would happen, like you say, he said, but them dudes, they didn't know what the hell to do. You were lucky to be allowed. The hospital was supposed to go in and out of it. So I remember that year he got around. He helped around because they don't mean a damn thing. Unless they're paying their way and learning what the hell they're doing. But anyway, that was what happened to him. And anyway, finally, the hell with that guy, I didn't want him around here, so he kept him out of there. But he used to come in, he thought he was a fire chief, and he would tell him, he used to get talking at the bar, getting lunch, and they said, "Down here, busting." "Well, Walter, do you have any fires today?" "No," he says, "not today. We had one yesterday down back in a certain lots," he said, "back there." So I said, "I heard you saved the well anyway. The house burned down, you saved the well," and he really thought he was a fireman. But I laughed. He'd go in and out of one of these stones, and there was several of them around. There's these restaurants at the foot of the hills from the cemeteries where all the people would come in and eat after a funeral. But anyway, one day there was a couple guys come in towards the shop. In the alley back of our place, and I remembered O'Malley had a big shop. He had a big board fence around the back of his restaurant now. He had a big corner lot, all kinds of room. And these police were out in the alley, and I remember that what happened anyway, why these guys, in the meantime, they were doing things my dad didn't know, but anyway, why this Walter Halgren, he heard that, or saw a couple of these big pieces that put them in money back, and they put them under my dad's stairway. So anyway, why that man Walter, instead of telling my dad about it, he down my dad didn't know doing that. He went down and he told O'Malley, he says, O'Malley says, Flynn's got a couple of your keys up there under his stairway. And he I went back there and he looked at who they were and he turned them out. But made him so goddamn mad. He said, Walter Holdren was telling him Mary down there. He said, that's why I'm up here to tell you. He said, you might be coming up here. So anyway, my dad, he turned them out. So that way, he put Walter on the, on the blacklist, I guess. Didn't have any use for him, but I don't laugh anyway. He was the goddamn mad of what happened to him and him getting hurt and falling down there. That I remember I was at the room there standing by a slot machine and looking at the slot machine, and then I see this Walter come in, and there was nobody in there. My dad, who's behind the car. And anyway, while Walter, he walks in, he's standing right in front of a big plate glass window. My dad, he reaches under the bar, he gets a great big potato bag. Now, it's just a story out of it. That's not. He took that thing out of there and he wound that thing up, he swung around. Walter was standing right in the big plate glass window, looking like a monkey, and didn't know how to say something or anything. He just stood there and found along this thing around about a couple times, and he let go and hit him right on top of the head. Anyway, Walter went down on his knees, and I thought, boy, is he going to come out of this or not? He ran over to the door on his hands and knees, and out the door he goes and heads right up into the cemetery. Anyway, about an hour later, I thought, boy, I better go up there and see if Walter's still making it. Might be dead. So I went up there, and here he's sitting on a tombstone. He was rubbing his head. And I said, well, how are you, Walter? And he said, oh, I'll be all right, I guess. So anyway, he walks down the yellow. He walks right back, past my dad's saloon again, and heads over to another saloon. But getting back to all this, he was the guy that was the cause of my father's death. Around a year later, my dad never did feel after that, Bob couldn't walk or hardly get things. He just got him down. But anyway, Bob bought a gun off of Joe LeBeau. Somebody had a bunch of them that they got somewhere, and I remember it was an L.C. Smith shotgun, a double barrel, and a trap gun, shooting clay pigeons, and he's a hunter. Yeah, my dad, he takes the streetcar and heads for downtown, and he gets down there, and he goes to some sporting goods store, and he bought a barrel of clay pigeons and a trap. Did a deal that put these clay pigeons in and shooting them off, and that way he could practice a bit on these clay pigeons. He liked to hunt, he liked to shoot, just to practice up. But at the same time he was down there that day to get this stuff, he got awful sick. And finally, anyway, he went to the Mercy Hospital, which is not far from right downtown. And from there he stayed overnight. So the next day, he comes on home, and about 3-4 days he was around home, and then he started getting worse. Finally, anyway, he went over, they took him over to Blue Island, the hospital over there. So he was over there for 3-4 days and kept getting worse. And finally, anyway, I was walking on the street around Mount Greenwood. Anthony hollered at me and said, hey, he says, come over here. He says, your dad's over in that hospital in Blue Island. I said, yes, I know. Well, he says, here's Carp. He says, you don't have any money. Here, he says, you get me $50. He says, you better go on over there and see your dad, because I don't think he's going to be around much longer. So anyway, I takes the streetcar from 111th Street, and I went over to St. Vincent, Vincent Avenue, the Craftsman catches interurban streetcar that goes to Kankakee, but it goes to Blue Island. Went right by this hospital, so I gets off there. And I see my dad there, and Mom was there, and anyway, I was talking to him, and he was for about 15, 20 minutes, and he told me, he said, I'm never going to get out of here alive. He said, I've had it. He says, no, I haven't gone long. A couple days that I won't be here. And he wasn't. Finally passed away, and anyway, I remember he took his body down to 9th and Laughlin. That's where Molly had an apartment. Dennis Allen, husband at that time, he was on the saloon for his spot on 59th Street. So anyway, that's where they had the wake in Molly anyway. There they had these great big limousine hearses, and I can remember that's where the funeral started. And from Molly's place, we went way downtown to some old neighborhood, I guess where Pa used to go to church years ago, before, when they were first married. And they drove all the way down there. That's where they had the services. And then from there, they come all the way on back to Mount Olivet Cemetery, and that's where they buried him. Well, anyway, after that, my mother run the saloon a while. Of course, John and Dan, they were firemen, and my mother had a bartender by the name of Henry R. that used to tend bar, and anyway, I think he was making more money. He was dropping till mostly, like most of the people do, and they know they can get away with it, they'll do it. But it seems funny to me, at that time, John was pretty big. He wasn't a little kid anymore. And it's funny that somebody like him wouldn't have kind of stayed right there then and kind of run this business. But it wasn't much longer after that, another year or two, and the whole country went dry. They voted it dry. And that was along about 1916 and 18, along in there. And they had the war was on with Germany, and so they went and they voted the United States dry. So she finally closed it up and pulled out and went back to South Dakota, which is the worst thing she ever did. To go back there, she might as well stayed where she was at, because none of us ever did anything in South Dakota to get ahead there. Anyway, back in South Dakota, one day there was a guy named Becker. He come over there, and he wanted to buy our farm. The farm at that time was nothing but a bunch of old buildings that moved up together. It looked like the High Chaparral. And he offered my mother $25,000 for it at that time, and I thought that was an awful lot of money at that time. And I said to her, I said, why don't you take it, and then we'll move to Omaha, Nebraska. And down there, I said, I can get a job. I'm just ready to go to work now. And I said, I don't want to stay out here and farm. But she stayed out there, and she went and started getting loans. She helped John buy he had 50 head of cows that he bought. And she get him money to buy them and the horses and stuff. And then Dan, she put him in the farming business. Not only doing all this, what we had, he goes ahead, and builds a house right on the farm there and everything, and then boards $6,000 to keep on going, and build it up. And later on in years, as time went on, the damn drought come on, dust storms, nobody raised anything, and hell, she never did make nothing off that farm, only put it in. That was the worst mistake she ever made. She would at least, we'd went to Omaha, she'd had a good house and modern, and one of the best houses down there, all nice brick and that, but she didn't see it that way. I finally went back down to Omaha, and I got a job working for Jim, driving a truck, and he was selling electrical supplies, farm lighting plants, equipment like that. Anyway, I worked for him for quite a while. There was a guy named Wilson that really, he was biggest owner of the damn thing. So, finally, anyway, why, at that time, why, Wilson was in kind of a wildcat oil drilling. And he was down in Oklahoma. They drilled down there, and they finally get oil down there. Pretty soon, why, I thought, I wanted a lot of excitement. So I headed down there. I worked down there firing 4 big steam boilers. I was just a kid then. I can remember this oil fields. It was really quite a deal. People from all over the world were there, from Alaska to California, from other oil fields from everywhere were there. And I'll never forget the different things that took place. I could go on and on talking, but anyway, I worked for quite a while. And John also, he was down there. He got it in his head that he'd like to start a moving picture theater. He had another oil field over in another district. And so he goes over and he puts $500 down on a vacant lot, which was on a main street. He was over there one day. So he took off for Gregory to see his pulp. He was going to get him to go in with him and was going to start this theater. But by the time he went up to Gregory back, a few days went by. By the time a few days went by, when they got back down there were only 4 theaters built in operation. Sound picture news, Europeans playing in it. They were built out of old corrugated iron, all these billets. And I finally got a job working there. These streets were nothing but just red sand. And one day I heard somebody scream, and there's a woman coming out of a restaurant. She was all on fire. She put gasoline in one of them old gasoline stoves. They had a gas tank way up on a little pipe, some spilled over, and she was out there in the street and on fire, gasoline all. I was rolling her around, but she died. I can remember these Texas Rangers coming into town, and they were, looking for dinner. So we stayed around there a while, and pretty soon, the big oil boom was just about over, and they had everything under control. And I remember I went on back to Omaha, and in the meantime, Jim was this Wilson, and he used to come back and forth from Oklahoma, and he'd have a big Paracero call, one of them big limousines with the headlights clear out on the fenders, So anyway, one day, Jim knew a guy by the name of Joe Wolf. So Joe Wolf, he used to have 2 taxi cabs. He had big Hudsons. And Joe Wolf told Jim, he said, I've got a friend. He says, this guy has got the patents on a fire escape. And this guy's been drunk ever since, he said, his wife died. The day that they got married, she died. And anyway, he's all upset. He's been drinking. And so he said, I'd like you to meet him. So Jim went over to this place, this hotel in this Curly Coffee. He told Jim the trouble he had and everything. He said, if you give me $500, he says, I'll give you half of the interest in the damn business. Jim says, well, I'll think it over tonight and I'll come back. I'll see you tomorrow. Let you know what we're doing. If I want to go into this adventure. So Jim thought it over, and they had 110 of these fire escapes at that time on schools in Omaha. And it was a pretty damn good looking deal, So Jim got thinking, well, hell, he said, for half of that, they used to sell for about $350 is all they looked like as a stovepipe, and only big, and they slide down still. So finally, Jim got his mind going. He thought, well, hell, if the school board will pay $350 for one, they'll pay a 750 or maybe more. So he went in with him and he took over and controlled it and he ran it. And anyway, that was the beginning of Jim getting where he was when he went out and for years and made out good. So at the same time, I even used to work for Jim, installing these fire escapes all over the United States, Michigan and Tennessee, everywhere. Illinois was everywhere. I got a lot of traveling. I traveled thousands of miles, 30 Georgia, all over, everywhere. So that was the first experience I had of traveling around the United States. And I covered about 40 states. Well, he had that until finally the Depression come on, and of course Dan worked for him too, and I was laid off. He preferred to help Dan, and of course Dan worked for him, and when he didn't have work he could draw money on him and this and that. So Dan stayed with him. It was the best thing I ever did. Anyway, I spent quite a bit of time during that Depression trying different angles to make a living. I also built myself a big saw, and I used to go up on the Missouri River, and I'd pay the fellow $1 for a whole truckload of wood. I'd cut these trees down, these great big cottonwoods, and I had this saw, the big blade on, it was about 5 foot across. It's a big sawmill rib blade that I changed the teeth on it to a crosscut. I used to go all the way up there with this truck, and I'd haul a big load of that cotton. I had about 8 or 9 tons of it because most of it was greenwood. Of course, a lot of it I cut down dry wood too, so I could burn with it. And when I look back, that time I was selling that wood, I'd get probably $10 for a whole truckload. Where now they get $40, $50 for just a quart of it. And it's green here when they pay that for it. So, doing that, and besides that, I was doing some bootlegging, anything to make $1. And at one time that I remember, there was nothing to do around there. There was no jobs around there outside of WPA. So you'd work on that. They don't let you work so many hours a week. And they didn't, you couldn't draw over $5, $6. Oh yeah, it depends on how many children. So get that, and then again, one time I painted that Catholic priest house. I got $2 a day for painting, for putting the paint on it. I worked there for about 10, 12 days. I painted that priest house. But times really were tough then, and to tell anyone now about times then that goes over their head like a tent, they don't even hear it. They can go on to hear it. You know, I know a lot of people that just were living on nearly nothing. And if you didn't have somebody giving you something, why, you wouldn't have nothing. But nobody ever gave me anything. I worked for everything I ever got. And anyway, I even also had I was even manufacturing whiskey, anything to make money. Didn't make a difference. They never did bother anyone much, only if they selling it to the Indians or some young kid, but I never did sell it to any young kids if I could help it. And I remember one time Ari Anderson and we were cutting wood together down on the Whetstone Creek. We could get a permit from the boss farmer and cut this off the Indian land. So we cut this wood and Ballard Indian. And I had this saw, we could saw it up. But I remember this day we was coming in, you know, I had this big truckload and Jesus, as big as a hay rack, you know, and I blowed a tire out. I remember I got home about 8:30 at night. It was late in the fall and the winter, going into winter and cold weather. In November it was. And I remember when I pulled over to where my place where I lived with this oil station that was hadn't closed, but I used that to live in, and that's where I lived. So anyway, I remember this night I come home and everything was dark there, you know, in the house, and finally Gussie came to the door and I said, "What's the matter?" And she said, "Well, the Internal Revenue men are all over town today." She said, "John Bean called me up and told me they were in town," so I thought I better not even go to answer the door if somebody come along. I wasn't selling any whiskey by the pint then, I was selling it by the gallon. And I had this great big still in my basement, 8 barrels of mash underneath my basement, where I was making this stuff. But anyway, it says, well, hell, if they didn't show up around now, they probably won't come anyway. So I wasn't afraid. They'd already caught this Harry Anderson that was with me cutting wood. When he got home that night, they'd already searched his house. He used to sell whiskey by the pint. And he sold it to some Indian. This Indian was in with the Internal Revenue. And anyway, they come to his house and they just where to get it. He kept it in the front of an old phonograph. He could raise out the front of it, kind of a cloth, kind of a scroll cut on it where that sound comes out. He could raise that up, and there's where he'd have his whiskey. And they knew just where it was, and they went and got it. I remember he had a hell of a time for a long time. They were driving back and forth to Walls, having court on that. And when I look back, I can figure I was always damn lucky. I never did have any close calls like that. That was the closest I ever come getting in it. But finally, anyway, I went and saw these houses. You could buy these houses off the farms for anything. I bought one out north of Gregory for around, I paid them $300 for it. Then I give a house for $300 to move it. The same house in 1917 or 18 cost $8,000 to build it. So I moved it in, and I borrowed the $800 off of Jim so I could pay for the house, move it in, and I had enough money to buy a little cement because I had to have enough money to buy some windows and stuff because some of them were knocked out, fix it up, buy sinks and stuff. But I remember I got it all fixed up, and then later on I took a notion, well, hell, this war business was getting closer. This here was about 6 months before Pearl Harbor. We were in Gregory, and anyway, they were making airplanes for foreign countries. And so anyway, I thought, well, hell, I'll go to Seattle. So Vic Lindholm and his wife and a couple of kids, they had a relation living over to Hokum. So anyway, it says, let's go on out. So I went with them, and we started on a trip. And by God, we got as far as Yellowstone Park, and Ida Lindholm, Vic's wife, who was Gus's sister, got awful sick, and I thought, by God, she was going to die. She was throwing up all the time. And so Vic says, shall we go on to Seattle? And I said, hell, you don't need to go on there on account of me. And I said, just turn around. I said, we'll head back to Gregory. Because Gregory, one of the kids, the oldest girl, Lindholm girl, stayed in Gregory, and she knew some fellow that she finally married later on. But anyway, we went back, and in 4 or 5 days, they turned around. They headed back for Illinois where they lived. And anyway, I had this trailer partly built. So I thought, well, I'll just get that finished up. So I finished it all up, and I had this Ford truck, and I said, let's go, and we'll go to Seattle. So anyway, we pulled it out here to Seattle, and I went to work, and finally I worked at Boeing's for a while, and starting wage at Boeing was about 65 cents. I got 90 cents because I used to work on fire escapes and iron worker. I got a little bit more money, and I worked there about 2 or 3 months. They finally kept shoving a lot of help in with me, and they weren't paying me for no lead man job. And I told them, I said, I want more money, or I'm going to get the hell out of here. They said, well, you can't get out of here. We'll throw you in the Army. And I said, well, like hell. Now remember, it was on a lunchtime at night. It was late at night. I picked my toolbox up and went out of there, and I come home and got the... I said, what you doing? I said, I quit that damn place down there. I said, I'm not going to work there no more. I said, they won't pay me. He said, what are we going to eat on? I said, the hell, what are we going to eat on? I'll get a job. The next morning I went down to Labor Temple, which is up above downtown at that time. And I goes down there and I asked him about a job. And they says, well, we'll send you off to a place. You can talk it over with me, see what you can do. So anyway, I went to HRL. We done a lot of repair work on ships, ducks, boats, made valves, all kinds of ship repair. Anyway, they had all the ferry boat work, and I used to work with a fellow, and we went down and worked on these ferries and went back and forth to Bainbridge Island, Bremerton. Anyway, why, hell, instead of making 90 cents an hour with that other place, I just started making $1.30 an hour right there. And hell, I got all the overtime I want. I was making 2 to 3 times as much a week as I was at Boeing. And they're the bunch of cheap screws that they ever were in. They'd hire people from out of here when they wouldn't anyone here. But anyway, I worked for each of them for quite a while, and then finally later on, Jerry had asthma. We used to take him down to a doctor down there in the dental building, in the medical building. Anyway, this doctor said he couldn't cure him there. Give him shots and crowds. He just about had convulsions, like he's going to choke to death. So I said, it was right around Christmas time. I said, let's get the hell out of here. And he said, you better get out of here. It's no good for him here. It's too damp. So anyway, I talked to Gussie and I said, let's sell our trailer and we'll go down to California. He said, go inland, a little waves from the water, go in. And it's warmer and drier. So we went down there and we looked around for a few days, but we thought everything was a damn high price that we didn't know if we'd want to stay there or not. Well, I got thinking at the time, we had some friends back in Deadwood. We heard from them before we left Seattle, and they said everything was just cheaper than hell. There was nothing going on. Everything closed down. There was no mine going on or nothing on account of this war business. So anyway, we thought, hell, we'll go back and maybe I had enough money that I could go ahead and buy a place. And where it was a different climate, a drier climate. I remember we bought a triplex for about $6,500. Later on, we sold it for $20,000 after I fixed it up. And then Jerry is feeling better. And so we turned around and we come on back to Seattle. I had a truck. When we was in Deadwood work, and I worked for a guy named Barry and run a big creosote plant. I used to fire out there and be a treating engineer on treating these creosote telephone poles and railroad ties. I worked for him. We were in Deadwood for 9 years, and then we left there and we come to Seattle in '52, and I got a job back in the shipyard working for Todd. Well, I worked there from the beginning. It was about on July the 8th, we started there in '52, and I worked there until right after Christmas. By God, they laid nearly everybody off, even most of the lead men. Laid them off. So anyway, I got thinking, well, what the hell are we going to do? I bought a house over in West Seattle, over on 40th Avenue. So I think I did pay for it. So anyway, Gutsy and I, we decided maybe we'd go out and look and buy a motel. So we knew where to buy one. We didn't want to buy one way out in the country because we figured everybody passed up. We wanted one right in town. So we made a deal. We traded this house in for $16,000 and a $5,000 contract that he had on a house in Rapid City for a down payment on this big motel. We run it for a couple of years, and we made out pretty good there. And then we finally, after running it, getting close to this talking about a World's Fair, and I said, y'all are building new motels pretty soon. I says, things will be, so damn many of the motels after that fair, there probably won't be much business. So I said, let's sell it. So anyway, I was thinking about selling one day. I was outside of it, walking on Aurora Avenue, mowing a little parking strip I had there. Pretty soon, Gutsy and all, and I said, the guy wants to talk. His name is Clint Johnson. He wants to know if we want to sell this. So I said, I'll go in and talk to him. I talked to him. He said, would you sell your place? And I said, that all depends. That's what I really want to do is sell it. And I said, he says, well, he said, I know two fellas that live way out the Golden West Motel, way out. They sold their place, and they'd like to make some kind of a deal for your place. We only had 12 rentals there, and a place to live in. We lived in the main office. back in plenty of room there. So anyway, I says, well, it all depends. I said, we'll sell it if we get the right price. Well, he said, I'll tell you. He said, they'll pay $125,000 for it. Yeah, but they'll have to trade some paper in. I said, what do you mean paper? He said, well, they've got a contract on an apartment house up on Barn Avenue for $25,000. Would you take that in on it? And so anyway, I says, well, if it's good, I will. So anyway, he come and he talked, and he brought these guys a couple days, the next day, and after that, about 2 or 3 days time, why I said we'd sell it. So we made a deal with these guys, and they got in there and we started out. We moved out up on Green Egg Hill of the place up there in Jacksonville. We stayed there for several months, and then we went over to Magnolia. We bought a house there and stayed there for a year or so, and then pretty soon we sold it. We come over to West Seattle, where we're living right now on 46th. So that was it. And all the time, I always worked either in a shipyard or finally I worked for the shipyard, Puget Sound. And then pretty soon a lot. And I worked for Colby Crane quite a few years, building these big whirly cranes and that was a pretty good job. And after that lot, we bought that shipyard, which they have today. Of course, I worked on maintenance down there, taking care of cranes and air compressors and everything. Any kind of repair I would work on it. If it's possible to fix it, we do it. So I worked there until I retired when I was